I woke up, gasping for air that wasn't there. My lungs seized, choking on heat that scraped down my throat like shards of glass. Every breath burned, as if my insides were being scorched by invisible embers. But I kept breathing. I had to. Panic gripped me before my mind could piece together where I was. I blinked, but the darkness didn't change. It was thick, suffocating, a living thing pressing down on me. My eyes adjusted, but there was no light to meet them. Just a sickly glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, bathing the air in a dim reddish hue. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, as if the very weight of existence was bearing down on me. My fingers clawed at the ground beneath me, rough, jagged stone that scraped my skin. It was raw, uneven, and unnervingly warm, radiating a heat that seeped into my bones. A low, guttural hum echoed around me, vibrating through the floor and into my veins, like the pulse of something ancient, something alive. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and rot, a pungent, suffocating scent that clawed its way into my nostrils and settled in the back of my throat. I coughed, but the taste of decay only deepened, coating my tongue with a bitterness that made me gag. I tried to stand, but the ground shifted beneath me, like it was breathing, a slow, agonizing inhale and exhale that carried a low, almost imperceptible groan from deep within the earth. My head pounded, a relentless throb that echoed behind my eyes. Memories clawed their way to the surface, fragmented and jagged, refusing to fully form. I remembered a flash of light, a screech of tires, the world tilting, spinning out of control, and then nothing. I was dead. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, sucking the remaining air from my burning lungs. Dead, but this wasn't what death was supposed to feel like. There was no peace, no release, only this endless, smothering heat and the weight of something wrong pressing down on me. Where am I? My voice came out as a rasp, barely louder than the persistent hum vibrating through the ground. The sound echoed, bouncing back at me from unseen walls, distorted and stretched until it felt like the echoes were mocking me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. Each step echoed with an unsettling finality, reverberating through the space like a hammer striking stone. I couldn't see him at first, but I felt him. The air grew heavier with every step he took, pressing down on me with an almost suffocating intensity. A presence filled the void, something ancient and unfathomably powerful. And then he emerged. The glow brightened just enough to reveal a figure stepping out of the darkness, impossibly tall, his silhouette shifting as though it refused to be confined to a single form. When it finally settled, his suit was immaculate, blacker than the void itself, and tailored to perfection. But it was his face that held me captive. Too perfect, too symmetrical, as though it had been crafted by something that had studied human beauty but didn't quite understand it. His features were sharp, almost predatory, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but endless darkness. A smile curved his lips, but it was devoid of warmth. It was the kind of smile that predators wore before they sank their teeth into their prey. And when he spoke, his voice was smooth, velvety, laced with a charm that was as dangerous as it was alluring. "Welcome, Eli." My heart, or whatever was left of it, clenched at the sound of my name rolling off his tongue like an old friend greeting me after years apart. "You are right on time." I didn't speak. I couldn't. His presence was suffocating, his words carrying the weight of inevitability, I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. His smile widened and he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. "I know you're confused," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "It's always disorienting at first, but don't worry. I'll explain everything." His eyes never left mine as he extended a hand, palm up, as though offering me something unseen. "You've been given an opportunity, Eli." My throat tightened, but I managed to whisper. "Opportunity for what?" The smile that spread across his face sent ice down my spine despite the sweltering heat. "Why, to leave, of course." His words echoed in the oppressive stillness, and for a moment I dared to feel hope. But then, his grip sharpened and I realized something was wrong, horribly wrong. "Leave?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why, yeah, but not for free." His fingers curled slightly, and for the briefest moment I saw it. A shimmer of something dark and binding, invisible threads stretching from his hand towards me, as if he was already pulling the strings. "You'll have to earn it," he purred, his tone dripping with satisfaction. "Oh, but don't worry, Eli, it'll be fun." His eyes gleamed with something cold and ancient, something that made my soul ache. "Let's make a deal." And that's when I knew hell was only the beginning. My body, or whatever I had become in this wretched place, felt anchored to the ground as though unseen chains had latched onto me the moment I awoke. I tried to move, to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. The heat pressed down harder, seeping into my skin like molten lead, weighing me down until I was certain I'd be swallowed whole by the earth itself. But I couldn't take my eyes off of him. The devil stood there, patient and unmoving. His outstretched hand remained impossibly steady, palm up. Fingers curled slightly in a gesture that seemed almost inviting. But I wasn't fooled. I licked my cracked lips, tasting ash and something sour that clung to my tongue. My voice came out hoarse. "A deal? What kind of deal?" His smile widened, just enough to make the pit in my stomach grow deeper. He tilted his head slightly, as though amused that I'd asked. "Ah, straight to business. I like that," he purred, his voice a melody of silken shadows. He took a step closer and the temperature spiked. The air shimmered around him, distorting like heat waves rising off asphalt. His polished shoes clicked softly against the stone, each step sending a reverberation through the ground that I felt in my bones. "Here's how this works, Eli." His tone was smooth, practiced. "You're in hell. I don't need to tell you that. But unlike most unfortunate souls down here..." He paused, and for a moment I swore I saw something flicker behind his eyes. "You have potential." Potential? I echoed, my throat tightening as the word hung in the oppressive air. I didn't like where this was going. "Why, yeah. You see, Eli, most souls that find their way here are predictable. They scream, they beg, they break. But you..." He leaned in, just enough for me to feel the searing heat radiating from his presence, though his tone dropped to something softer, more intimate. "You're different." I swallowed, but my throat was too dry. "Different? How?" His grin was a predator's, and his eyes, those fathomless pits of obsidian, gleamed with satisfaction. "You're not broken yet." His words slithered into my ears, coiling around my thoughts like a serpent. "And that makes you valuable." "Valuable for what?" "Ah, now we get to the heart of it." He straightened, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from his suit with an almost lazy grace. He began to circle me, slow and deliberate, like a vulture orbiting something already half dead. His footsteps echoed unnervingly, each tap against the stone ringing out like a distant drumbeat. "You want out, Eli? I can offer you a way." His voice was softer now, almost comforting. "But freedom, true freedom, comes at a price." I felt the weight of his words settle over me, a cold shiver running through me despite the suffocating heat. "What kind of price?" He stopped directly in front of me, his eyes boring into mine as though peeling back the layers of my soul. "Simple," he murmured, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'll give you a series of tasks, nothing too difficult." "And if I complete them?" "If you succeed, you'll walk out of here free." "And if I fail?" My voice was barely above a whisper. His smile didn't falter. "Fail," he mused, as though tasting the word. "Well, let's just say failure has its consequences." His eyes gleamed with something that made my insides turn cold. "Consequences?" I echoed, dread pooling in my gut. "Permanent consequences? You'll wish you'd stay dead." My pulse, or whatever it was, pounded in my ears. The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating and crushing. Every instinct I had screamed at me to refuse to walk away, but there was no walking away from this. "What kind of tasks?" I forced the question out, though my throat felt like it was closing. His grin sharpened. Now that is where things get interesting, my friend." He took another step forward, so close now that I could feel the heat radiating off of him, an unnatural warmth that seeped into my bones and gnawed at my resolve. His eyes held mine, pinning me in place, and when he spoke again, his voice was a low whisper that crawled along the edges of my mind. "You'll confront sins, Eli. Souls. If you don't complete the challenges set before you, then you stay forever." My chest tightened. There was no other choice. I barely had time to take another breath before the devil's grin deepened, splitting his face like a gash carved into flesh. His teeth, unnervingly white against the scorched backdrop of hell, gleamed with something sinister, reflecting the dim, hellish glow that surrounded us. I'll do it. Whatever gives me a chance to get out of here." "Good. I knew you'd see reason, Eli." The devil purred, his voice dripping with satisfaction. His eyes narrowed, and I could feel the weight of centuries behind that gaze. Before I could even process the magnitude of what I had just agreed to, he extended his hand again. But this time, something appeared in his grasp. The air itself seemed to fold and ripple, and with an unsettling hiss, a long, rolled parchment materialized from the ether. The edges were scorched and blackened, as though the contract had been forged in fire. Its surface was an unsettling shade of yellowed parchment, but the texture was wrong. Too smooth, too organic. I realized with a sickening jolt that the material wasn't paper. It was skin. I swallowed hard as the parchment unfurled itself before me, stretching unnaturally, the edges curling as if it were alive, pulsing faintly, as though the damned soul it had been peeled from was still trapped within its fibers. My eyes skimmed the words etched into its surface, the ink gleaming like fresh blood beneath the dim, reddish glow. Contract of escape. The letters were sharp, jagged, as though they had been scratched into the flesh with something cruel and unforgiving, as if this contract was written on the person while they were still alive and then flayed. The language twisted and danced as I tried to read it, the words shifting in place, making it impossible to focus for more than a few seconds before they blurred again. It was as if this contract didn't want to be read. "Don't strain yourself," the devil murmured smoothly, his voice now laced with a mockery of reassurance. "The details can be overwhelming for some mortal minds." He stepped closer, the scent of sulfur and burning flesh thickening in the air. The contract rolled itself tighter, slithering upwards like a serpent coiling in his hand as he spoke. "Here's what you need to know." His voice was honey-coated poison, smooth and persuasive. "This is your way out." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, savoring the weight they carried. "A series of tasks, each one tailored specifically to you." His eyes gleamed, and I felt them peel back the layers of my soul, exposing every dark secret I'd ever tried to bury. Complete them and you walk out of hell. Simple, right? "Simple," I echoed, but my voice was hollow. I didn't believe a word of it. "Of course, there are a few formalities." The contract unrolled itself once more, extending toward me like a hungry tongue. I glanced down, eyes scanning the impossible script again. The words rippled and twisted, but some of the phrases managed to pierce through the fog clouding my mind. Obligations to be fulfilled in their entirety, failure to comply will result in forfeiture of soul, and completion of contract guarantees the end to your current suffering. "What happens if I succeed?" The devil's eyes flickered just for a moment. If you succeed, Eli, you'll be free. Free to leave this place, free to reclaim what's left of your life." Something was off. His words felt too polished, too carefully chosen. "What's the catch?" "Catch? Why does everyone always think there's a catch?" "Because there always is," I murmured, my voice barely above a growl. He chuckled, the sound reverberating through the cavernous expanse around us. "You're smarter than most. I appreciate that." He tapped the parchment lightly with one gloved finger. "But trust me, all you need to do is fulfill the terms. The rest is beyond your concern." Beyond my concern. The words echoed through my mind, rattling around in the hollow pit that formed in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to walk away, to refuse, to fight, but I couldn't. The moment I set eyes upon that contract, I had already lost. The contract was already binding me. I could feel it, the invisible weight pressing down on me, the unseen chains tightening around my soul. I had no choice. My hand trembled as I reached toward the parchment. "Son, here," he murmured, and as I looked down, a single line appeared at the bottom of the contract, the ink forming my name. All it needed was my mark. A quill appeared in my other hand, thin, sharp, and wet. I hesitated. It needed my own blood. The devil, with his one-taloned hand, reached out and dug into my palm, blood pooling from the wound. "Go on," the devil whispered, his voice coiling around me like a noose. "Seal the deal and take your first step toward freedom." My mind screamed at me to stop, but the weight of inevitability crushed me. I dipped the quill into my blood and touched it to the page. And the moment it did, I felt it. A cold, sickening pull, like something inside me was being yanked loose. The parchment pulsed, drinking in my signature like a leech. The ink writhed, slithering through the fibers as though carving my name into the very essence of the contract. And when I lifted the quill, the deal was done. As the devil took the contract away and rolled it up, I saw words I didn't see before written on the back. What's that on the back?" "Ah, don't worry about that. That's just formalities. Now, let's begin." The darkness around us stirred, and hell opened its jaws. The ground beneath me shifted, or maybe it was the world itself. I felt weightless for a moment, as if the devil's presence had unmoored me from reality. My vision blurred, and the suffocating heat of hell was replaced by something worse. A new landscape unfolded before my eyes, a barren wasteland where jagged rocks jutted up like the broken bones of the earth, and rivers of molten fire carved trenches through the ground. The air was thick with the scent of scorched flesh and sulfur, and a low, mournful wind howled across the desolation like the wail of countless damned souls. But what drew my attention wasn't the hellscape itself. It was him. A lone figure staggered across the cracked terrain, his body a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone. His skin was flayed in places, strips of it hanging loosely as if the torment of this place had tried to peel him apart piece by piece. He stumbled, his bare feet scraping against the jagged ground, leaving behind a trail of blackened blood. His breathing was ragged, desperate, and then I heard it. The growl. Low, guttural. It echoed through the hellish expanse, reverberating off the rock and shaking the ground beneath me. My stomach clenched as I turned my gaze towards the source. The hellhounds. They moved like shadows, their forms barely solid, more like rippling darkness given shape. Their eyes glowed with a sickly crimson light locked onto their prey. Saliva dripped from their slavering jaws, sizzling where it hit the ground. "Ah, beautiful, aren't they?" The devil's voice was a velvet whisper in my ear, but I felt it crawl down my spine like ice. He was standing beside me again, though I hadn't seen him move. His grin was wider now, more indulgent, like a predator savoring the anticipation before the kill. "Poor soul," he murmured, almost mockingly. "He has been running for a very long time. Can't you hear how tired he is? How his spirit is nearly broken?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What am I supposed to do?" The devil chuckled softly, the sound slithering into my ears like silk. "Help him." Help him?" I echoed, disbelief thick in my voice. "Offer him hope. Give him a reason to trust you. Befriend him. And then betray him. My stomach twisted into knots. Lure him to the hellhounds, the devil continued, his voice gentle, as though he were describing a kindness. Convince him to follow you, and when the moment is right, let them feast. I turned to look at him, my mouth dry. Why? Why? Oh, because, dear Eli, the first step toward freedom is understanding that mercy is a luxury you no longer have. I couldn't breathe. My gaze returned to the fleeing soul. He was slowing now, his strength waning. The hounds were closing in, their low growls reverberating through the air as they circled like vultures. Go. Save him. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me toward the broken figure ahead. My heart pounded, though I wasn't sure if it was fear, guilt, or some horrid mix of both. The devil waved me off, and I ran out into the twisted wasteland. Hey! I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally through the barren landscape. The man stumbled, turning toward me with wide, hollow eyes. His face was gaunt, his features sunken, but there was something human in them. Something that hadn't been entirely stripped away by this place. Who are you? He rasped. I can help you, I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. I forced my expression into something resembling reassurance, though I could feel the devil's presence behind me. Watching, waiting. The man's eyes searched mine, and for a moment I saw hope flicker there. Please, they've been after me for so long. I can't keep running. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I know a safe place. Come with me and I can get you there. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't question me. He didn't hesitate. He trusted me. Thank you, he whispered, stumbling towards me. My chest felt like it was caving in, but I turned, leading him away from the approaching hounds. Or at least that's what it looked like. The run was agonizing. I could feel the hellhounds behind us, their growls a constant reminder of what was coming. But the man beside me, he didn't know. He trusted me. Not much further, I lied, my voice barely steady. He nodded, his steps growing weaker. I don't deserve this kindness. I did terrible things. I don't deserve to be saved. My throat closed. Neither do I. Everyone deserves a second chance, I called back to him. We rounded a jagged corner of stone, and that's when I stopped. The hounds had circled ahead, waiting in the shadows. Their eyes glowed with malevolent hunger, their bodies coiled with barely contained anticipation. This was it. The man didn't even see them. He turned to me, his expression filled with gratitude and trust. Thank you, he whispered again. I couldn't speak. My mouth was too dry. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shatter. And then I stepped aside. Now. The word was barely a whisper from my lips, but the hellhounds heard. They surged forward. The man's expression shifted. Confusion, then horror. Wait! But it was too late. The hounds pounced, dragging him down as he screamed, a sound so filled with agony and betrayal that it echoed in my bones. I didn't move. I couldn't. Bravo, 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 Eli. You're taking your first step. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because part of me knew this was only the beginning. The air thickened after my first task, the stench of hell clinging to me, like the aftertaste of something bitter and unforgiving. My mind felt heavy, exhausted from the betrayal, The way the soul's terrified screams had echoed in my ears as the hellhounds tore him apart. I hadn't wanted to do it. I didn't want to be this person, this thing that followed orders without question. But in the end, I did it. I followed the rules, and in doing so, I became something less than human. I felt the devil's presence again before I saw him. His form slid into view like smoke, stretching the corners of my vision. The air shifted, and I could hear his voice like a whisper threading through my mind. "You've done well, Eli. The first task was simple, won't it? The betrayal? The loss? It was just a warm-up. But I'm sure you understand by now. Hell is not so kind to its guests. You may have completed the first task, but we are just getting started." I swallowed. My body was still rattled from the violence of what I'd done, but I had no time to dwell. The devil was never far, always looming in the shadows, always watching. His figure stepped into the light, tall and impossibly graceful, like a predator assessing its prey. His eyes, those thick black pits that seemed to pull everything into them, they focused on me, dissecting me in ways that made my skin crawl. "And now," he said, his voice a velvet rasp that scraped against my nerves. "You're ready for the second task." I stood. "What is it?" He gave me a smile, slow and deliberate, as if savoring my discomfort. "It's simple, Eli. You've already learned what it means to betray a soul. But now, you must learn what it means to destroy one." I frowned, confusion flickering through my chest. Was he mocking me? "Where is the soul I'm supposed to save?" I managed, forcing my voice to remain steady, though I knew better than to expect an easy task. The devil stepped closer, stepped silent, his figure hovering near me like a dark cloud. "You'll find them in the heart of hell, deep inside the pit of despair, a place where no light touches, where all hope is drained away. Now go," he said, his voice sharp like the crack of a whip. "The task awaits. Fail, and you'll have no place here. You'll be lost to the void." Without another word, he made a small gesture and the room around us began to warp. The walls seemed to melt away, dripping like molten wax, and in their place, a dark vortex spun into existence. The pit of despair. I could already feel the pull of it, the weight of the souls trapped within it, the darkness that would consume everything. It was calling to me, beckoning me forward into the abyss. I didn't want to go. Hell, I didn't want to save anyone. But there was no choice. I couldn't back out now. I stepped forward, hesitating for just a moment, and then I was sucked in. The world around me twisted. I could feel the air thicken, the weight of it dragging me down. The smell of decay, of rot and burning, it all filled my lungs, making me choke. My vision blurred as I was swallowed whole by the darkness, and I felt my body slam against the cold, rough surface of stone. I landed hard, the impact jarring my teeth. The air around me felt suffocating, like a damp cloth pressed to my face, and I gasped for breath, trying to orient myself. The world around me was pitch black, with only the faintest traces of movement. Shadows shifting in the darkness. Whispers too soft to make sense of. Then I heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the thick blackness like a scream lost in a tunnel. "Who's there? Who's there? Come closer. Come closer and see what's left of me." It was a voice that carried with it the weight of despair, of hopelessness, and of something much worse. I stood, barely able to move, as the world around me slowly began to shift and contort. Then a figure emerged from the blackness, tall and thin. Their body was covered in what looked like burns, flesh charred and peeling away, revealing raw muscle and bone. It was clear that his soul, this tortured thing, was already far beyond saving. Their eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were dark pools of lifeless pits, hollow and empty, devoid of any hope or recognition. The soul that I was supposed to save. I stared at it, at them, for what felt like an eternity, my chest heavy, a sickly weight in my stomach. The devil was right. This was a game, a cruel, twisted game designed to push me beyond my limits, to force me to do something that I wasn't prepared to deal with, to turn me into something else. But the task had been set. There was no turning back. "Please, please help," the soul rasped, their voice barely above a whisper, but it carried enough venom to make my skin crawl. "I've been suffering for so long. I need to get out. I can't take it anymore." I stepped closer, feeling the thick, suffocating air of this part of hell pressing in on me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to buckle, as though it could swallow me whole at any moment, but I kept moving forward. The soul before me writhed in its suffering, twisted and broken, a mere shadow of the person it once was. Its cries echoed in the oppressive silence, a desperate and guttural sound. The soul had been here for what seemed like an eternity, its body scarred and mutilated from the endless torture, its mind frayed at the edges by the ceaseless pain. Yet still, it clung to one last shred of hope, that I could save it. The pleading words struck me deep in my chest, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. This was my task. I was here to destroy it. I was no savior. Hell had already devoured what little was left of his soul, and there was nothing more to salvage. But the voice, the desperate cry, it lingered like a whisper in my ear, scratching at the edges of my resolve. "Please," the soul gasped, its voice trembling like a broken leaf in the wind. "You have to help. I can't bear this anymore. Please save me. I've suffered so much. I can't go on. I need help." I cut it off. No. My voice was quiet but firm. It was the only answer I could give. There was no more life left here. The soul had already been torn apart by the ravages of hell. There was no way to undo the damage, no way to turn back the clock. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn and walk away. But the contract still hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating force that bound me to this place, to this task. And I knew that if I didn't do what the devil wanted, if I didn't fulfill the contract, there would be consequences worse than I could even begin to imagine. What if I ended up like this thing, this soul, trapped here? The devil's voice suddenly slipped into my mind, smooth as oil. "You're wasting time, Eli," he purred, his words resonating through my very bones. "Why hesitate? This soul is beyond saving. It's already been consumed by hell. The pain is its only existence now. What good is there in letting it continue to suffer?" I glanced down at the soul again, its eyes locked onto mine, the raw pain in them cutting through me like a knife. It was barely human anymore, its once soft features now twisted into something monstrous from the torment it had endured. There was nothing left of its past life but a shell. And yet, it still clung to the idea that I could somehow save it. And then the devil spoke again, his voice low and commanding. "You'll end its suffering, Eli. You'll end it quickly." The soul was still staring at me, but it had begun to fade, its form growing weaker, more fragile by the second. Its body seemed to shimmer and distort in the dim, flickering light, and the silence that stretched between us was unbearable. It wanted freedom. It pleaded with me for salvation, for help. But the task was clear. The devil had told me what to do. I reached out. The air around me vibrated with the devil's presence, and my fingertips hovered just above the soul's form. It gasped, its eyes wide with hope, still believing, still clinging to the last thread of its humanity. But I could feel it. The moment of truth was here. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. My hand had trembled as I placed it against the soul's body. It was cold as a slab of ice. There was nothing warm left here, no humanity, just pain. And then I squeezed. The soul's body convulsed violently, its form twisting and spasming in response to my touch, but I didn't stop. The devil's voice echoed in my mind, urging me on. "Finish it, Eli. End its suffering. You know what you must do." The sound of the soul's cries grew louder, more frantic, but I couldn't let myself be swayed by them. This was my task. This was why I was here. With a final crushing motion, I brought my hands together and twisted. There was a sickening crack, and the soul's form shattered like glass. The air around us pulsed with an explosion of energy, and in an instant, the soul was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood there, my chest heaving, my breath shallow as I processed what had just happened. The weight of it still pressed in on me, suffocating. But the devil's presence was still there, a constant, ever-watchful force. "Good work, Eli. You've completed your second task," the devil said, his voice rich with satisfaction. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. I had done what he wanted. I had destroyed the soul. And in doing so, I felt like I had crossed a line that I couldn't uncross. The task was complete. But the price I paid would haunt me for the rest of my eternity. The moment the atmosphere shifted, I knew something had changed. One second, I was standing in the pit of despair, and the next, I was surrounded by cold stone walls, high and oppressive, looming above me. My heart clenched as I looked around, realizing I was no longer in the open, but inside a vast, echoing chamber. The air smelled of mildew, damp stone, and something metallic, like the petrichor before a rain. There were no windows, no way to gauge the outside world, and yet I could feel the suffocating weight of the void pressing in from every angle. I stepped forward, my feet crunching against the cold, gravelly floor. The only source of light came from torches set into the walls, their flames flickering weakly as though struggling to survive. The shadows danced and twisted, reflecting the eerie, otherworldly energy that filled the room. The whispers of damned souls, unheard but palpable, echoed in the background, the sound vibrating through the floor and up into my chest. A grand obsidian bench rose before me, its surface cold and slick as though it had been freshly polished by some unseen hand. Atop it sat a seat that looked as though it had been crafted by nightmares. A high-backed throne with strange symbols etched into the armrests, worn with the centuries of use. I took a step toward it, my pulse quickening, but as I moved, I realized I wasn't alone. From the shadows, a figure appeared. A demon, tall and lean with pitch-black eyes that seemed to devour the light around them. Its features were sharp, angular and grotesque, and its smile was too wide, stretching across its face that made me feel terrible. "Ah!"
lie, Eli," the demon rasped, its voice slick like oil. "You've arrived, and with it your task."
Another figure materialized beside the first, this one even taller with red-scaled skin, horns that spiraled from its head like twisted branches, and a mouth that seemed to open too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It cackled, a dry, hollow sound.
"You are the judge now, Eli. The one who will decide who lives and who dies, or rather who suffers forever."
I didn't say a word. I couldn't. The weight of what I was about to face pressed heavily on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The task. The last one. The one I had no choice but to see through. The moment I'd entered this infernal realm, I knew the cost of failure. There would be no second chances. The first demon waved his hand dismissively, and the air around me shifted. A faint shimmer of light appeared, and as it solidified, I saw a figure standing in the center of the chamber. A soul. It was a man, though his form was flickering, as if his existence were in a constant state of flux, shifting between the mortal world and the afterlife. His eyes, wide with terror and desperation, met mine. He looked human, young, perhaps barely into his 20s, and his expression was a mirror of the agony I had come to know all too well in hell. He stumbled forward, his eyes wild with hope. "Please, Judge, you have to save me," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I haven't done anything wrong. I swear I don't deserve this." The demon in red chuckled, its laughter dark and rumbling, as though the sound came from some infernal pit deep within.
"Do you hear that, Eli? He thinks he can be saved, but what he doesn't know, what he never knew, is that his fate was sealed the moment he breathed his first breath. Every soul here is guilty, even the innocent ones."
The words rang through the chamber, and I could feel them settle into my bones, each syllable like a stone dropped into the well of my consciousness. The demon's voice carried a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. It was true, of course. In this place, no one was truly innocent. No one escaped the reach of hell. No one left without their sins, their failings, their regrets. But still, this soul, this man standing before me, he didn't look guilty. His face was young. His features were still soft with the remnants of life. There was no malice in his eyes, no bitterness, only confusion, fear, and the desperate glimmer of hope. The soul's body flickered again, his form wavering like a candle's flame caught in a gust of wind. I saw a light in him, a light that was fighting to survive. He took a hesitant step towards me, his eyes wild with a mixture of disbelief and pleading. His voice cracked, a choked sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I don't belong here. I never hurt anyone. I didn't. Please, you have to understand. I didn't deserve this. I wasn't a bad person." The demon scoffed, their laughter like the scraping of nails across a chalkboard. The red-skinned demon took a step forward, leaning down towards the soul, its voice dripping with venom.
Is that so, mortal? Did you not harm those closest to you? Did you not abandon them when they needed you most? Did you not watch as your selfish desires tore apart everything you once held dear?
The soul flinched, the light around him flickering brighter for a moment before it faded, his hands trembling at his sides. I didn't mean to. I didn't want that to happen. It wasn't my fault."
"But it was,"
the demon interrupted, its tone growing colder, more accusing.
"You ran. You chose your own comfort over the well-being of the ones who loved you. You closed your eyes to their suffering. You took what you wanted, when you wanted, and left the wreckage behind you."
The soul's gaze dropped to the ground. His body swayed, as if he couldn't bear to look at us any longer. But even with his eyes cast down, I could still see the conflict brewing inside of him. He wasn't completely convinced by the demon's accusations. Not yet. He clung to that thread of hope, that belief that he hadn't deserved this, that there was some part of him that remained pure, untouched by sin. I didn't know what else to do. I was trying to survive. I wasn't thinking about anyone else. I didn't hurt them on purpose. The demon chuckled.
Survival. Is that what you would call abandoning your family in their time of need? You turned your back on them when they needed you most, choosing the easy path. You left them to fend for themselves, all in the name of your own survival. Tell me, did you even think of the consequences of your actions?
I watched the soul shrink back at the words, but something in him shifted. There was a tremor, a flash of guilt, but also an undeniable sense of frustration. Frustration at being judged for his past choices. Frustration at not being allowed to properly defend himself. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want to be this person. I didn't choose this. I was trying to protect myself. I didn't know the consequences until it was too late. The demons seemed amused by his pleas. Their laughter faded into the shadows, but the red-skinned demon turned his gaze on me.
Tell him, Judge, the demon purred. Tell him that the truth is irrelevant. His fate was sealed the moment he chose to abandon his responsibilities. It doesn't matter that he didn't intend harm. What matters is the harm he caused. Whether or not he could see it, the soul is beyond redemption, and you know it. You know that his guilt lies not in what he wanted, but in what he didn't do.
I felt the pressure mounting, the weight of their words settling on me like 1,000 tons of stone. My chest tightened again as the soul continued to plead, his voice rising with panic, his form flickering like a dying flame. I couldn't shake the feeling that this isn't what he deserved. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to lead them. I swear I tried to fix it, but it was too late. It all fell apart. I just wanted to escape. I didn't think it would.
But it did. It did, and now here you are. There's no going back now. No amount of pleading will change the fact that you failed those you loved. Your inaction condemned them.
I was the judge. This was my choice. His life or his damnation. His guilt wasn't about what he had done, not entirely. It was about what he had failed to do. His weakness, his inability to act in the face of responsibility had led to his fall. But that same weakness, that same fragility now lay in his words as he begged me to see past his sins. But there was nothing I could do. No justice to be had, even though I would have deemed him innocent. I knew I couldn't, because I was standing in the middle of a courtroom with no rules, no fairness, and no absolution. And the only thing that mattered was making a decision that would seal someone's fate. In that damn contract. I had to make a choice that I didn't want to make. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck, thick and heavy in my throat. The demons were waiting, their eyes unblinking, hungry for my answer. The weight of their judgment pressed down on me as if they were expecting something. No, demanding something from me. In the end, I knew what I had to do. The weight of the soul's fate pressed against me. I could feel it. The moment of decision, the last breath of mercy that would never come. The words rose from deep within me, each syllable heavy with finality. I I sentence you to eternal damnation, I whispered, my voice barely louder than the crackling fire that began to spread beneath his feet. The soul's eyes widened in horror as the words settled over him like a death sentence. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for mercy, but the flames were already licking at his skin. Hellfire, born from the very core of this infernal place, surged up like a tidal wave, swallowing him whole. His body convulsed, a single scream tearing from his throat before it was consumed by the raging inferno. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh and despair, a suffocating wave of heat that seemed to burn my very soul as I stood there, powerless to stop it. The sound of his cries twisted into silence, replaced only by the crackle of flames that devoured him. His last moments, desperate and fearful, became nothing but ash. His soul, now broken and damned, was lost forever. I could hardly breathe. The weight of my choice, the weight of his destruction, crushed me from the inside out. I had done it. I had made the call. The guilt of it, the responsibility of it, sank deep into my chest, heavier than anything I'd ever carried before. And then, just like that, the scene shattered. The world around me broke apart, disintegrating into a million fractured pieces. The courtroom, the demons, the soul, everything vanished, leaving only darkness in its wake. I felt myself falling, plummeting through an endless void, the world above me growing smaller and smaller as I descended deeper into the abyss. My chest tightened as the coldness of the void pressed against me, threatening to swallow me whole. And suddenly the world snapped back into focus, and I found myself standing in a room of steel and stone, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and sulfur. The walls were lined with chains, some still dripping with crimson stains. This was no place of punishment I had seen before. This was a personal hell, tailored just for me. The devil stood before me, his towering form blocking the doorway, his grin wide and knowing. The room hummed with the quiet power that radiated from him, filling the space with a kind of oppressive heat that made my skin crawl. Well done, Eli. You've come so far, the devil said, his voice dripping with mock praise. I swallowed hard, my chest still tight from the trial, from the judgment. The guilt gnawed at me like a constant presence in my chest. What is this place? I asked, my voice shaky. I tried to keep the tremor from my hands, but the fear coursing through me was undeniable. Ah, this? The devil's smile grew wider, his eyes gleaming with something like satisfaction. Why, this, Eli, is your personal torment room. Your very own little corner of hell. A place where I will keep you bound and broken for all of eternity. What? I still have a chance, don't I, to undo all of this? I completed all the tasks. The devil chuckled, a sound that reverberated in the pit of my stomach. Wow, Eli, always the optimist. You see, that's the problem. You think you can undo the damage, that you can escape the consequences of your choices. You never read the fine print. What are you talking about? The contract, of course. He spread his arms wide, as if presenting the entire realm of hell itself. The one you signed when you agreed to my terms. You thought it was a simple escape, didn't you? You thought you could make it out, that there'd be no cost and no price to pay. But there's always a cost, Eli. My mind reeled. The words didn't make sense. Yeah, I'd signed the contract willingly, without understanding the full extent of what I was agreeing to. I had been so desperate to escape, so consumed by my own fear that I hadn't bothered to look at the fine details, the hidden clauses buried in the legalese.
"You're not a bad soul, Eli," the devil continued,
his voice almost tender now, as if he were pitying me.
"Not truly, but you're flawed, weak. You wanted to run from the consequences of your actions. You thought you could bypass the pain, the suffering you caused. But you never understood how deep it ran. With each task you completed, each soul you destroyed, you in turn destroyed your own. The more you gave in to me, the more of yourself you gave away." My hands shook at my sides, a cold sweat prickling my skin.
No, this can't be true. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I thought I was doing what I had to do.
And that, my dear Eli, is the beauty of it.
The devil's voice was smooth, like a silk thread wrapping tighter and tighter around my neck.
You thought you were doing what you had to do, but you were always choosing me, always giving in step by step. Your soul was never as clean as you thought. It was tainted the moment you signed the contract. And with each task, it grew more and more entwined with mine.
The reality of his words hit me. I had been so focused on each task, each moment, that I hadn't realized the consequences of my actions. I hadn't understood what it meant to bargain with the devil.
But there's still time for you to learn, Eli. Time to understand. You'll never be free from me now. Your soul belongs to hell, and you have an eternity to learn the consequences of your actions.
With a crushing finality, I realized there was no escape, no way out. It was too late. The devil turned on his heel, his presence lingering for just a moment longer, as he gazed back at me with that infuriating, knowing smile.
"Enjoy your stay, Eli,"
he said, his voice dripping with amusement as he disappeared through the door, leaving me in the cold, oppressive silence of the cell. The door creaked shut behind him, the heavy sound of metal against metal reverberating through the stone walls, sealing me in this suffocating prison. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet, a stillness so thick that I could almost hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. But that peace didn't last. The air seemed to grow heavier, as though the very space around me was pulsing with malevolent energy. It came slowly at first, the sound of chains scraping against stone, the hollow thudding of footsteps echoing in the corridor beyond. And then the instruments of my suffering came into view. Spikes, chains, cruel whips, all designed to tear, break, and twist. I could hear them, feel them, even before the door to my cell groaned open once more, the hinges protesting with an awful screech. The demons flooded into the room with unearthly shrieks, their dark forms shifting and contorting like shadows given shape, eyes glowing with the promise of unspeakable pain. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing me in with my tormentors. And there, in the center of it all, I stood frozen, knowing that there was no escape from the hell that I had created for myself. It was one of those nights that felt timeless. The kind where the world outside doesn't matter and the only thing that exists is the group of us sprawled across my living room floor. The couch was a tangle of limbs and empty pizza boxes, remnants of an all-day movie marathon that had started with the classics, The Goonies, Jaws, Ghostbusters, and drifted into whatever random horror films we could find. Zoe was curled up in the corner of the couch, her legs tucked up under her, a bowl of popcorn in her lap as she kept flicking through her phone. Theo was leaning against the armrest, focused on whatever was playing on the TV, and Sasha, well, she was sprawled on the floor, tucked into her hoodie like she always was when she didn't want to be bothered, her back against the wall. The air smelled faintly of melted cheese and something vaguely sweet, probably from all the soda we've been downing since the movie first started. Even with the window cracked open, the warm night air was creeping in. The room felt a little heavy. It had been a long week, but now, this was perfect. No pressures, no distractions, just us. We were playing some strategy board game, and was always a step ahead, always seeing things that others didn't. Me, Evan, the master of logic. "Well, I'm gonna have to call it soon, Evan," Theo said, his voice low, not looking away from the TV. "I have an early shift tomorrow." Evan grinned at me, but I could tell there was a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. Theo had been the one looking out for us since high school, making sure we didn't do anything too stupid. He had this quiet, reassuring vibe about him, like he could handle anything that life would throw at him. Sasha didn't respond immediately, which was typical. She never really got involved unless she had to. She sat there, her eyes half-lidded as she scrolled through her phone, tapping at the screen with something close to disinterest. Not like Zoe, who was always on 10, constantly full of energy and bright ideas. I half wondered if Zoe had ever known how to sit still in her life. And then I felt it. A buzz. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, a simple, sharp jolt that pulled my attention away from the board game. I picked it up without thinking. The notification was a text message from an unknown number. I frowned, squinting at the screen. "Hey, Evan, we've got something for you. 4 tickets to the Carnival of Midnight tonight only. It's a one-time event. No ads, no promotions. It's just for those who are meant to find it. Meet us on the outskirts of the old cornfield at the edge of town. 9 p.m. Bring the crew." For a moment, I just stared at it, blinking, as if my mind was trying to make sense of the words. Sasha, as if sensing the sudden shift in energy, looked up from her phone. "What's that?" she asked in her usual half-bored tone, but her eyes were starting to sharpen. "I don't know. Just got some weird text." I paused, reading it again. "The Carnival of Midnight. Ever heard of it?" Zoe leaned forward from her corner, her eyes bright as usual. "A carnival? That sounds so fun! I mean, one night only. It's like secretive, mysterious. It could be something magical." I could already feel the skepticism rising in me. No ads, no promotions? That alone seemed too off to ignore. I clicked the link that came with the text, the bold letters reading, "The Carnival of Midnight," lighting up on my phone screen. The page loaded quickly, showcasing a dark, almost otherworldly image of a circus tent, backlit by pale, ghostly lights. Carnies, tents, and stands full of trick games were strewn about. A towering Ferris wheel spun slowly in the background. The sky behind it was pitch black, without a single star. Beneath the tent were blurred, ethereal figures. And people, I guessed. But their faces were blurred out. The page was sparse, offering only a few lines of text. "Step into the unknown, a place where wishes are granted, secrets are kept, and souls are tested. The Carnival of Midnight opens for one night only. Will you dare to enter?" I stared at the screen for a moment, a part of me already saying don't go. But another part, well, I couldn't deny that the intrigue was there. The skeptic in me was already crafting explanations for how this could all be some elaborate prank. But that gut feeling, that pulse of curiosity I tried so hard to ignore, kept pushing me. I looked up at the others, holding the phone out in front of me. It's a weird invitation, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Maybe it's one of those pop-up things? It could be interesting. Zoe was already bouncing in her seat. I want to go. Maybe it'll be like a haunted carnival, or like a cool, spooky experience. She looked between the rest of us, her eyes wide and filled with that infectious excitement. Please, 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 let's go, guys. I was about to say something, to call out how insane it all seemed, but Theo's voice interrupted me. It's just one night, and if it's a bus, we leave. Let's try it out. If it's a real carnival, I'm in. I hesitated for a moment, then exhaled sharply. Maybe I was overthinking this. What was the harm? It could be a prank, but it could also be something totally harmless. A chance to do something different for once. I looked back at my phone, the timestamp showing that we had just under 2 hours to get there. I tapped the screen and sent the message back. We're in. We packed up the games, cleaned up our mess, and made our way to my car and all piled in. The road stretched out like a ribbon of cracked asphalt, unraveling toward the horizon. Street lights flickered above, their dim glow barely pushing back the encroaching darkness. The night felt heavier than usual. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other drumming anxiously on my thigh as Theo's playlist hummed softly through the speakers. Sasha sat beside me, leaning against the door with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the passing trees as if expecting something to jump out. She hadn't said much since we left. Typical. She always got quiet when she was thinking too hard. Zoe was in the back seat, head tilted against the window, her eyes wide with wonder as she stared at the stars above. She was probably daydreaming again, lost in one of her imagined worlds where anything was possible. Her fingers traced absent-mindedly over the condensation on the glass, sketching little spirals and stars. Are we even going the right way? Theo's voice cut through the quiet, a hint of unease creeping into his usually steady tone. He was in the back seat with Zoe, leaning forward just enough to see the dark road ahead. Relax, man, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. The GPS says we're close. Yeah, and it's taken us halfway to the middle of nowhere, Sasha muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't wrong. We had driven far beyond the outskirts of town, past neighborhoods we knew, past the old gas station that had been abandoned for years. And now, we were skirting the edge of nowhere. Trees pressed in on either side of the narrow road, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, more still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then we saw it. A soft glow, barely visible through the trees, pulsing like a heartbeat. Golden lights shimmered just beyond the line of the cornfield that stretched endlessly into the night. The stalks were dry and brittle, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. There, I said, more to myself than anyone else. My foot eased off the gas as I spotted the entrance. A towering archway arose out of the darkness, impossibly ornate for something that hadn't existed hours ago. The sign stretched across the top in curling vintage script. The Carnival of Midnight. The letters glowed softly, their gold hue flickering like candlelight. Beneath the arch, the path leading in was lined with crimson banners that fluttered lazily despite the dead air. A wooden ticket booth stood just beyond the archway. This is weird, right? Theo asked, muttering his thoughts to the rest of us. Definitely weird, Sasha muttered, her jaw tight as she scanned the scene with narrowed eyes. Zoe, however, was already halfway out of the car. Come on, guys, she said softly, her voice full of awe. Look how beautiful it is. I felt it too, a subtle tug, like invisible strings guiding me forward. Let's just check it out, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We came this far. Reluctantly, Sasha and Theo followed as we moved toward the ticket booth. Zoe, ever the dreamer, was already a few steps ahead, her eyes wide with wonder as the lights of the carnival reflected in her pupils. The booth looked as old as the carnival itself. Worn wood, chipped paint, and a glass window smudged with fingerprints. But it wasn't empty. A man stood behind the counter, and God, was he something out of a nightmare. His grin was the first thing I noticed. Too wide, stretched unnaturally across his gaunt face. His teeth were jagged, uneven, and yellowed, like they'd been filed down with a rusty blade. Deep-set eyes stared out from under a wild mop of unkempt hair, his pupils so dilated they practically swallowed the irises. His skin was pale, almost waxy, with veins that bulged at his temples. And his clothes, a patchwork suit stitched together from mismatched fabrics. Stripes, polka dots, and diamond patterns clashed violently, the fabric fraying at the edges. His sleeves were too long, hanging past where his hands should be, and his collar was stained a sickly brownish color. But the worst part? His arms. The sleeves hung loose because there was nothing inside them. His arms just ended above the elbows, but the way he moved made it seem like they were still there, invisible and twitching as if they were itching to grab something.
Evan,
he rasped, his voice a wheezing, sing-song melody that sent ice water down my spine.
Party of four.
My head turned and Zoe froze mid-step. Theo's hands instinctively went to my shoulder, and Sasha, I swear I saw her hand itch toward her pocket like she was ready to pull a knife she didn't even have. How do you know my name? I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. The carny let out a shrill giggle that echoed for far too long, like a distorted recording.
Oh, we've been waiting for ya.
His grin stretched ever wider. He leaned forward, pressing what was left of his arms against the counter, his hollow sleeves dragging along the wood.
The Carnival of Midnight never forgets an invitation,
he whispered, his voice barely above the rustling of the cornfield behind us.
And we never turn away our guests.
The tickets were still sitting on the counter, 4 of them fanned out like a deck of cards. The gold trim shimmered faintly, almost pulsing. What the hell is this? Theo muttered under his breath. We should go, Sasha whispered, her voice barely audible. But Zoe... Guys! Her voice was soft, almost hypnotized. She was staring at the tickets, her fingers just inches away from them.
Yes, take them. The show is about to begin.
A sickly sweet smell wafted from the booth, candy apples and something rotten beneath it. My hand hovered over the tickets. Evan? Theo's tone was a warning, but it was already too late. My fingers brushed the cool surface of the tickets.
Enjoy the show,
the carny whispered, his voice a twisted mockery of warmth. As I grabbed the tickets, the lights beyond the archway brightened, flaring to life like fireworks in the night sky. The Carnival of Midnight didn't feel so bad at first. Actually, it was kind of awesome. The moment we stepped inside, the air was filled with the sweet scent of kettle corn and cotton candy, swirling together with the faint crackle of distant fireworks. The lights overhead were dazzling, neon blues and purples that pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The sounds of laughter and carnival music drifted through the air, making it impossible not to feel a little excitement. All right, this is cooler than I expected, Theo said, his arms crossed but a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Zoe spun around, her eyes wide with wonder. It's magical, she whispered, taking in the kaleidoscope of colors. Like something out of a dream. Or a fever dream, Sasha muttered under her breath. But I caught the way her lips quirked up as she glanced at the crowd, Even she wasn't immune to the charm of the place. We started with the Ferris wheel. It was bigger than any I'd ever seen, towering over the rest of the carnival like some ancient garden. As we climbed higher, the cool breeze brushed against our faces, carrying the distant hum of carnival sounds below. "Damn," I murmured, looking down at the maze of colorful tents and attractions. "This place is huge." "Feels like it goes on forever," Theo said, his voice trailing off as he scanned the horizon. Next was the carousel, but not your typical one. The horses were carved with intricate, lifelike detail, and they moved with a fluid grace that made it feel more like riding real animals than wooden figures. Zoe giggled the whole time, her hair flowing behind her as the carousel spun faster and faster. "Okay, that was fun," Sasha admitted afterward, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. We took turns at the ring toss, where Theo showed off his uncanny aim. He nailed the first shot with casual precision, the ring clinking perfectly around the glass bottle's neck. The second and third followed just as easily, like he'd been doing it his whole life. "All right, hotshot," I muttered, but Theo just grinned and pointed to the prizes. "Pick one," the carny said, his grin a little too wide. Theo's eyes scanned the shells before landing on the doll, small, porcelain, dressed in a tattered red dress. Something about it stood out. Without a second thought, he handed it to Sasha with a small, almost shy smile. He shot her a wink as he did so. Sasha raised an eyebrow but took the doll, her fingers brushing his for a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks, Theo," she murmured, her voice quieter than usual. I got a little too competitive at the hammer strength game, trying, and failing, to ring the bell at the top. Sasha tried her luck at skee ball and nearly beat the high score, while Zoe dragged us to a fortune teller's booth, where an elderly woman with cloudy eyes muttered something about a journey you can't escape. "Creepy," Theo muttered as we walked away, but none of us took it seriously. Time blurred as we bounced from one attraction to the next. Bumper cars that sparked and screeched, a mirror maze where our reflections stretched and twisted in impossible ways, and a fun house that left us breathless from laughter. Even Sasha, who was usually the first to point out when something was off, seemed more at ease. I caught her grinning more than once, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. For a while, it was perfect. "I hate to admit it," I said, walking alongside the group with a contented sigh, "but this is actually pretty cool." "See, I told you," Zoe said, practically skipping ahead of us. "Sometimes you just gotta believe in a little magic." "Magic, huh? Or maybe just good marketing." Theo chuckled, nudging me with his elbow. "Whatever it is, I ain't complaining. We needed this." I almost forgot about the creepy carny at the ticket booth. I almost forgot the unease I'd felt when we first walked in. The eerie fortune teller from earlier. Almost. But then, as we walked past a row of game stalls, I saw him, standing by the ticket booth, watching. I thought it was just another carnival worker at first, until he came more into focus. He was tall, draped in a crimson coat with gold embroidery, his presence too still, too deliberate. A black top hat sat atop his head, casting a shadow over his face. But I could still see his grin, wide and unnatural, teeth gleaming like ivory under the flickering carnival lights. His eyes hollow and dark, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I blinked. He was gone. I shook it off. Just my imagination. "Come on," Theo said, breaking the moment. "Let's hit one more ride before the main show starts." "Yeah," I said, forcing a grin. "One more." But deep down, that uneasy feeling was back, and it wasn't going away. We left the ring toss behind, the laughter and flashing lights fading as we wandered deeper into the carnival. The air grew heavier with a scent of burnt sugar and something something wrong underneath it, like metal in decay. The noise of the crowd dimmed as we approached the massive main tent, its striped fabric swaying gently even though there was no breeze.
"This is where the real show happens,"
a voice echoed from somewhere unseen. We didn't question it. We just kept walking. All right. Anyone else getting a weird vibe, or is it just me? Definitely not just you, Sasha said, her eyes darting around. She was holding the doll Theo at one, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his painted eyes were watching us. We stood near the main stage, a massive ornate platform at the heart of the carnival. Golden lights rimmed the velvet curtains, but their glow felt dimmer now, like they struggled to hold back the surrounding darkness. A hush fell over the crowd as the lights dimmed even further, and that's when we stepped forward. The ringmaster. Tall and impossibly thin, he moved with a fluid grace, his crimson coat sweeping behind him like a cape. His suit was crimson and gold, immaculate but somehow wrong, as if the fabric itself was stitched from something alive. A black top hat sat atop his head, casting a shadow that seemed deeper than it should have been. And his face, pale as bone, with a grin stretched impossibly wide, made it impossible to tell if he was amused or starving. "Why, ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the carnival, smooth as silk, but with an undercurrent that sent a chill down my spine. "Welcome to a night you'll never forget." His eyes gleamed, and for a moment, I swore they locked onto me. But before I could react, he gestured dramatically towards the crowd. "But first, let's give a warm welcome to our brave first contestants of the night." A spotlight swung around, illuminating a group standing just a few yards away. Another group of friends. There were 5 of them. 2 guys, 3 girls, about our age, maybe a little older. They looked just as confused as we were, glancing at each other with nervous smiles, like they weren't sure if they should be excited or terrified. "Wait." Zoe's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're like us." "Of course they are." The ringmaster spread his arms wide, grinning as if he'd read her thoughts. "Each of you accepted our special invitation, but I'm afraid none of you truly understood what you stepped into tonight." The crowd around us murmured, but there was something off. I noticed it then. The audience wasn't real. The people cheering and clapping weren't the people at all. Their faces were blurred, distorted like bad reflections in a funhouse mirror. My stomach dropped. "What the hell?" Theo whispered. "Tonight," the ringmaster continued, pacing along the edge of the stage, "you are all bound to the carnival. None of you can leave until you've played the games. And won." "What happens if they lose?" I whispered to Theo before I could stop myself. The ringmaster's smile deepened. "Ah, why don't we show ya?" His eyes twinkled with something dark. The 5 strangers were ushered down to the main stage by carnies whose eyes were too dark. The first game was simple, a maze of mirrors where they had to find the exit before the time ran out. I watched, breathless as they navigated the twisting glass corridors. They had 5 minutes. They beat the timer by less than 30 seconds. "Not bad," the ringmaster purred, his tone dripping with amusement. "But that was just the warm-up." The second game was worse, a test of trust. Each of the friends had to walk a narrow plank over a pit of darkness while blindfolded. One friend was allowed to walk in front, guiding the others with her voice and name without having to wear a blindfold herself. The first two made it. The third wobbled but barely caught herself. But the fourth... a scream. The plank gave way beneath her feet, and before any of us could react, the ground split open. Clawed hands, black as tar and writhing with sinew, shot up, grabbing her by the ankles and dragging her down. Her screams echoed in the night as the darkness swallowed her whole. "No!" At his friend's cries, he tore his blindfold off, reaching for her, only to be yanked down himself by another set of grasping claws for breaking the rules. Two gone. Just like that. The rest of the group was frozen in horror, but the ringmaster clapped, his grin revealing horrid teeth. "Ah, but we're not done yet. For the final game," the ringmaster purred, "we're gonna play something classic." The crowd stirred as a massive game booth was wheeled into the center of the tent. The booth looked old, paint peeling, wood splintered, and the bright colors long faded to dull, sickly hues. Rows of carnival prizes lined the shelves, stuffed animals with hollow, dead eyes, glass jars filled with murky liquids, and dolls that looked almost too lifelike. "Step right up," the ringmaster announced, his voice dripping with malicious glee. "It's time for Knock 'em Dead." 3 sets of metal milk bottles stood stacked in pyramids on the booth's worn surface. Each set was slightly different. One was painted blood red, the other black, and the last one a sickly green. "The rules are simple," the ringmaster said, twirling a brightly colored baseball in his gloved hand. "You get 3 balls each. That's 9 total. Knock down all 3 sets of bottles and you're free to go." "That's it?" one of the remaining friends asked, voice shaken. "That's it." The ringmaster tossed the ball toward him. "Ah, but I forgot to mention." The 3 friends approached the booth, each grabbing a ball. That's when they saw it. Faces. 2 of the faces were the faces of the friends they had just lost, trapped inside the bottles. Their eyes were wide with silent screams, mouths contorted in agony. "Miss?" The ringmaster tapped his cane against the ground, and the faces twisted in torment. "And they stay trapped forever?" "We can do this," one of the group whispered, trying to convince himself as much as the others. They each took aim. Their first throws were too weak. The bottles barely budged, and the faces inside screamed soundlessly. "Harder!" one cried, her eyes wild with desperation. They threw again, harder this time. 1 pyramid of bottles toppled. They threw their final set each. One hit the second stacked dead center, but only the top bottle fell. "No," one of them muttered. His voice trembled as the last grains of hope slipped away. One of the girl's throws went wide, missing the third set entirely. "No, no, no, no!" The ground beneath them rumbled. The faces behind the glass, so close to freedom, let out a final silent scream. The friends screamed as the ground opened beneath them, sucking them down into the depths. The ringmaster clapped slowly. "What a shame. But hey, you gave it your best shot." The ringmaster's voice rang out, cutting through the thick air of the circus tent. "Step forward, my brave souls. It's time to play the first game. Will you succeed or will you fail?" The ringmaster locked his eyes on us. Sasha and Zoe shot me nervous glances as we hesitated, but the carnies were already moving towards us, their twisted forms reaching out with hands that were too long and fingers that curled like claws. Before we could protest, they were pulling us toward the center of the tent, toward the grotesque carnival game. In front of us stood 3 large glass boxes, each with chains securing them shut. I couldn't make sense of it all, my mind racing with confusion and dread. The carnival had seemed so fun at first, but now we were walking into a nightmare we couldn't escape. The carnies wheeled out the ring toss stand, the exact one Theo had won earlier. 3 of you will go in the boxes, and 1 of you will shoot your shot for the others, the ringmaster called out. I caught a glimpse of Theo standing beside the ring toss stand, looking tense. His eyes met mine, full of determination. He would be the one. "Don't worry, Evan, I got this," Theo said, trying to mask the fear in his voice. They shoved Sasha and Zoe into the first 2 glass boxes, strapping them in place. I was forced into the third, the heavy glass closing around me with a chilling finality. The ringmaster laughed, the sound echoing in the tent. "Ah, yes, the blood bucket toss. Your fate rests in the hands of your friend Theo." I looked out at Theo, now holding a stack of 20 large rings given to him courtesy of the carnival. Theo's face was a mask of concentration, but the pressure was mounting. Every one of us was bound in these glass boxes, and they started to fill with blood, thick, crimson, and menacing, filling from some unseen force. Sasha's box was filling first, the liquid pooling around her feet. She was struggling against the chains, her eyes wide and frantic. Zoe's box was next, the blood creeping up her legs. And me? I could already feel the warm wetness of it at my ankles. My stomach turned. Theo stepped up to the stand, gripping the first ring tightly in his hand. The carnies around us hummed with unsettling anticipation. The ringmaster, eyes glinting, called out, "Every moment that goes by means more blood, more risk. Will Theo's aim be enough to save you?" Theo threw the first ring. It missed. I felt my heart skip a beat as the blood around Sasha surged higher. Her gasp of fear cut through the tension. She shook the glass, rattling the chains as she realized the stakes. Theo grabbed another ring. He threw it, this time more focused. It landed perfectly. The blood around Sasha's feet began to recede, but it wasn't enough. The pressure was unbearable. Theo's throws became more frantic, more desperate, each one carrying the weight of our lives. The blood continued to rise. Zoe's was nearly full now, and Sasha's was approaching her chest. I glanced up at Theo, my voice tight with fear. "Theo, please, hurry!" Theo threw another ring, and it missed again. The blood surged. The crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch as Theo's movements grew erratic. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes darting between the rings and us, his friends, bound and helpless in the glass. He wasn't just playing for fun anymore. He was playing for our lives. Theo took a deep breath and threw again. A second ring landed. The blood went down, but only for a moment. With the blood rising higher soon after, Theo didn't hesitate this time. His next throw was quick and sure. Another successful toss. But there was no time to feel relief. With only 2 rings left, the blood had nearly reached Zoe's neck. Her body slammed against the glass, her breath coming back in panicked gasps. Theo reached for the final 2 rings, trembling. He didn't look at us. He didn't look at the crowd. He just focused. One final shot, and we'd either survive or... Theo tossed the first of the last 2 rings. It soared through the air, landing with a clink over the bottle. "Make one more shot and your friends are free to leave the box, Theo," the ringmaster called out. The final ring. Theo gripped it with a shaking hand. His heart was pounding in his chest. He looked at me one last time, our eyes locking. I nodded. "You can do this." Theo threw the last ring, and it landed. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. Then the blood around us faded. The pressure released, and Sasha, Zoe, and I were freed. We were drenched in the blood, but we were alive. The glass boxes unlocked, and the chains holding us down fell away one by one. The ringmaster grinned. What a show! What a triumph! I felt my stomach churn as we stumbled out of the boxes, the blood dripping off of us in thick, wet strands. A carny came by and hosed us down, leaving us in the chill night air. We didn't know what was coming next, but we were out. For now. The cheers of the carnival goers still echoed in my ears as I staggered off the stage, the scent of blood thick in the air. My legs felt unsteady beneath me, my heart still hammering from the last game. The glass box, the rising blood, the way my lungs had burned for air, I could still feel it clinging to me like the phantom hands trying to drag me under. Sasha coughed beside me, shaking off the last of the ordeal. And Theo just stood there, fists clenched, shoulders tight. He had saved us, but he was still reeling from the adrenaline. The ringmaster's booming voice cut through the noise. Ah, my dear resilient players, you've shown your worth, your determination. But we're just getting started. He swept his arms wide, gesturing toward a towering structure looming ahead of us, conjured from thin air from whatever insidious power the carnival possessed. It was a massive glass box, easily 50 feet tall, filled with what looked like a children's ball pit. But the colors were muted, grimy, and something else was mixed in. Bones. Some small, some large, some wet with blood. Above it, a mechanical claw, large enough to lift a human body, twitched and jerked as though eager to begin. Sasha inhaled sharply. No, absolutely not. Step right up, the ringmaster bellowed. Welcome to the Claw, a delightful game of agility, wit, and sheer dumb luck. He turned his gaze to us, eyes twinkling with something sinister. The rules are simple. Survive for 3 minutes. The carnies ushered us forcefully forward. Bony hands, disfigured grins, and 2 strong grips forced us to the game. Before I knew it, I was inside the glass pit, my feet sinking into the cold, slippery mass of plastic and bone. Theo banged on the glass. What the hell is this? The ringmaster merely chuckled. The claw above will make its choice. You run, you dodge, you fight. If it grabs you, well, let's just say it don't like to let go. A deep, metallic groan filled the chamber as the claw above twitched, adjusting its position. The game had begun. I looked towards the ringmaster to see a joystick with a gleaming skull appear in his grip. I saw his twitch and the first swing came. The claw lunged downward, slamming into the pit near Sasha. She barely rolled aside in time, plastic balls and loose bones scattering around her. I could hear her ragged breathing as she scrambled to her feet. The ringmaster grunted in dissatisfaction. The claw retracted, recalibrated, and struck again, this time coming for me. I dove, hitting the ground hard. The stench of old blood filled my nose as a claw just missed, grazing my arm with its cold metal talons. My pulse thundered in my ears. After a minute of ducking and dodging, the claw finally managed to grab Sasha. As she was lifted into the air, Theo jumped and grabbed at her leg, causing her to come tumbling down to the ground. She let out a scream of relief. We really need to recalibrate this damn thing, the ringmaster yelled out. Then it happened. With just 30 seconds left, Zoe screamed. I turned just in time to see the claw clamp around her waist, lifting her effortlessly into the air. Theo roared at the claw. Zoe thrashed, kicking wildly, her nails scraping at the metal fingers digging into her ribs. Get me down! Get me the hell down! The claw shook her violently, her limbs flailing like a broken marionette. A sickening pop echoed as her shoulder dislocated. Her screams turned into choked gasps of pain. She fought. God, she fought. Twisting, writhing, trying to slip free. But the claw was relentless, tightening its grip. Higher and higher it ascended, dragging her toward the choking darkness above, until, without warning, it changed course. With a sudden, stomach-lurching drop, the claw swung downward. The ground below shuddered, then split open with a deafening roar, flames licking hungrily at the edges of the abyss. The heat was instant, searing. Zoe screamed as the claw released its grip, sending her plummeting into the chasm. Fire swallowed her whole, her silhouette vanishing in a burst of writhing embers before the earth slammed shut, as if she had never been there at all. Then silence. The ringmaster sighed dramatically as the buzzer went off, signaling a temporary halt to our torment. Oh, what a shame, what a shame. She almost made it. The door to the glass pit creaked open, but none of us moved. We had survived, but Zoe hadn't. And we weren't done yet. My breath was ragged, my hands trembling as I pushed myself up from the mass of bones and plastic. The scent of blood and sweat clung to my skin. Sasha hadn't spoken, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the spot where Zoe had vanished. Theo stood rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The audience cheered like rabid animals, applauding, laughing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the claw game was gone. The towering glass walls around us shuddered and sank into the ground, swallowed by the carnival floor, as if they had never been there. The bones, the blood-stained plastic, all of it disappeared, leaving nothing but smooth, polished wood beneath our feet. The ringmaster sighed, shaking his head as he twirled his cane. Oh, the fragility of life, and the tragedy. But the show must go on. He grinned and snapped his fingers. The floor beneath us shifted. The wood panels rearranged themselves, clicking and sliding with mechanical precision. In seconds, the pit had transformed into a grand stage, its surface now a massive grid of glowing tiles. The air filled with the haunting swell of a distant waltz. Above us, guillotines descended, their gleaming blades catching the stage lights as they swayed in anticipation. The ringmaster turned to us with a flourish. And now, my dear dancers, shall we begin? The floor was made up of massive tiles, each one glowing in a mesmerizing sequence of reds, blues, and yellows. Suspended above them were enormous curved blades, each one hanging from the ceiling like the scythe of an executioner, gleaming under the stage lights. The ringmaster spread his arms, dripping with theatrical amusement. Welcome to our final performance, dear guests. A dance of precision, of grace, and of survival. Step lively, for every misstep may be your last. He twirled his cane, tapping the ground, and the music began. An eerie, discordant waltz played by an unseen orchestra. The rules were simple. Step only on the correct glowing tiles, matching the rhythm of the waltz, and make it to the other side of the stage. A single misstep, and the guillotine above would swing. At first, the pace was manageable. We moved in tandem, stepping carefully onto the correct tile as the music guided us, each of us taking our own path, but only a tile apart from each other. Theo to my right, and Sasha to his. The first swing of the blades came slow, a warning more than a threat, slicing through the empty air just inches from our heads. Then the music sped up. The tiles flickered faster, changing in unpredictable patterns. My breath was ragged, my muscles screaming with the effort to keep up. Sasha nearly slipped, but Theo grabbed her wrist, yanking her onto the correct tile just in time to avoid a blade that would have taken her head clean off. The music sped up again. The lights became erratic, forcing them to lunge, leap, and twist to avoid missteps. The blades swung lower, slicing away at the air with terrifying accuracy. Theo was panting now, sweat dripping down his face. Sasha's legs trembled. Then, Sasha stepped wrong. The tile beneath her flickered red. A blade dropped. Theo moved without hesitation. With a powerful shove, he pushed Sasha aside, taking her place on the doomed tile and pushing her onto the correct one. The guillotine came down. Theo didn't even have time to scream. A sickening slice, and his body crumpled, his head rolling to the side in a grotesque mockery of a dancer's bow. Sasha and I made our way through the last 3 tiles to make it to the end. The music stopped. Sasha was on her hands and knees, shaken, staring at Theo's lifeless body. My breath came in short gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ringmaster clapped. "A stunning performance, and now our final survivors may take their bow." The moment felt strange, like a distant hum in the air. The tension of the carnival's twisted games had finally dissipated, but something new lingered. Something darker. Theo's death echoed in the silence that hung between us, and the weight of it was unbearable. The cheers from the crowd had long since faded, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable quiet. The flickering lights from the carnival rides barely seemed to register anymore, their glow casting long shadows that stretched across the ground creeping toward us. We stood there, frozen, and all I could hear was a pounding of my heart in my ears. Sasha was breathing hard beside me, her face pale as she stared at the stage. I could feel her pulse racing, her body shaking with the aftermath of the waltz. We had survived, but at what cost? We stood there for a moment, unsure if we were meant to move, unsure if the carnival would let us leave. The ringmaster's words were still fresh in my mind, but there was no sign of him. No more games, no more crowds. Just the 2 of us and the unsettling quiet that had descended like a shroud. Then suddenly there was a rustling, like the air itself had shifted. The ground beneath our feet trembled as if the carnival itself was adjusting to some new reality. And then there he was. The ringmaster appeared before us, stepping out from behind the stage, his presence filling the air with an unnatural chill. The moment he emerged, I felt the tension in my spine tighten, like the air had turned solid around us. His face was impossibly calm, a mask of polite interest. But there was something more, something that felt off. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning us with an unsettling, amused curiosity. "Oh, well done," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've made it. You've made it after all. You survived." His smile stretched wider, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The air seemed to hum with his every word, the silence now more deafening than before. Sasha and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us knew what to say. I could feel the weight of his gaze on us, like he was measuring us, and calculating something in the depths of his twisted mind. And then, in an instant, the world seemed to shift again. The sounds of the carnival, the lights, the crowd, it all seemed to recede as if we had passed into another plane of existence, a place where the normal rules no longer applied. His hands swept out in an exaggerated flourish, as though he were showing us something grand. "The games are over. You've won, haven't you?" I stood there, staring at him. The words had no real meaning, not anymore. It was as though everything around us had stopped making sense, like a world that had turned upside down. There was no celebration, no applause, just the quiet, oppressive weight of our survival. And then, without warning, the ringmaster's expression shifted, just a fraction. The ringmaster's presence was smothering the air around us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear rising in my throat like bile. But there was something else, too. Rage, fury. You said if we won, we could leave. I spat, barely able to keep my voice steady. You promised us, you son of a bitch. He tilted his head, the gleam in his eyes almost amused. Yes, I did say that, didn't I? I could feel the heat in my veins, the adrenaline surging as I took a step toward him. So why the hell are we gone already? You told us the rules, we completed the games, we beat your twisted carnival, and you said we'd leave. We're done. The ringmaster's grin faded slightly, but his eyes never wavered from mine. You are done, he said softly, almost sympathetically. The games are complete. You have won. You will leave. I blinked, my mind racing. Then why are you still here? What the hell is this all about? The silence between us stretched, and for the first time I saw something like satisfaction in his eyes. He stepped back, eyes glinting with a cold, dangerous amusement. You still don't understand, Evan, do you? He said, his voice smooth and unhurried. You're free to go, but what you failed to realize is that you were never meant to win. I felt my stomach drop. What the hell does that mean? The ringmaster took a deep breath, as if savoring the moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he revealed the truth in a voice that seemed to echo in the air around us. This carnival, he said, his voice now lower, darker. It isn't about games. It's about harvest, souls, souls to feed my eternal hunger. But you... He paused, as though weighing his next words. You're the first to survive in a long time. And that, my dear boy, is impressive. But you weren't meant to. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. You've won, Evan. You and Sasha have earned your freedom. His voice was almost too sweet, dripping with mockery. But you see, I don't take kindly to people winning my games. The house is always supposed to win, after all. He stepped closer, his grin back. The consequences of your success is your freedom. And the price of those who failed? Well, their souls belong to me now. My mind raced. I wanted to fight back, but as he took another step toward us, I realized there was nothing left to fight. The ringmaster would keep his word. We had won, and now Sasha and I were free. You said we'd leave, so let us go, I demanded, my voice shaken. The ringmaster paused for a long moment before his grin widened once again. Oh, you will. I am bound by my rules. But let me remind you, freedom is never truly free. Without another word, the carnival around us seemed to shift, the lights dimming and the air thickening. The ringmaster stepped back, his eyes still fixed on us, the weight of his power hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Yes, go then, he said, his voice quiet but full of dark promise. Go and live. For now. The ringmaster gave a slow, deliberate bow. Until we meet again, Evan. Sasha, he said, his voice smooth as velvet, laced with something dark. He snapped his fingers, and the air around us shimmered, like the fabric of reality itself was bending. The carnival faded away in an instant, replaced by the familiar sights and sounds of the outside world. Before I could process what happened, we found ourselves standing at the front entrance of the carnival. The towering gates were opened, the lights dimmed, and the crushing weight of the air was gone, replaced by the cool night breeze. I glanced over at Sasha, who was just as stunned, her face pale, but her eyes wide with disbelief. Are we really out?" she whispered, almost as if she feared saying it out loud would make it all disappear. I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I think so." We began walking toward my car, our footsteps heavy but sure on the cracked asphalt. The closer we got, the more the sounds, smells, and lights of the carnival faded. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting the place to still be there, but when I turned back, I saw nothing. The carnival, the twisted lights, the eerie laughter, all gone. In its place, there was only the old cornfield stretching far into the night. "Evan, it's really gone," Sasha breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. Something felt off, like we were just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And as I reached into my pocket to pull out my car keys, a sharp, burning sensation made me stop. It was coming from my pocket, an unmistakable heat. I pulled out my hand instinctively and froze when I saw what it was. My original carnival ticket. The one that had started it all. I held it in my hand, staring at it as the edges of the paper felt strangely warm. The light of the moon reflected off of its surface, but something was wrong. The familiar, playful script that had been on the ticket at the start now appeared distorted, a dark twist to the writing. In the center, barely legible, was a message that sent an icy shiver through me. "The carnival never truly ends, and neither do the ones who play." We stood there for a long moment, the night air still and quiet around us, and in the far-off distance, I could hear the faint, mocking laughter of the ringmaster. And I knew in that moment, we weren't truly free. Not yet. The carnival was just waiting for its next chance. Liam stared at the blank wall across from his bed. It wasn't empty. It never was. His drawings clung to the faded wallpaper like small, desperate bursts of color, each one carefully taped at crooked angles. Some of them were houses with windows too big. Others were trees that didn't look like trees at all, just shapes in the vague outline of something green. But none of them were real. None of them were enough to fill the space between him and the room, between him and the real world. The colors on the paper used to be bright, vivid even, but now they looked washed out, as if they'd been scrubbed with a damp cloth too many times, like they had no fight left in them. He rubbed his eyes, as though that could somehow make the world brighter. But it didn't. It never did. He glanced at the clock on his dresser, its red numbers flickering faintly in the dim light. Almost 5 p.m. His mom would be busy with dinner, and his dad would be stuck in traffic for at least another hour. Just like yesterday, and the day before that, and every day before that. He had no one to talk to. Not really. His parents were always busy with things that didn't matter to him. Things he couldn't even understand. He was 6, but that was no excuse for the way they forgot about him. The way they acted like he didn't exist, unless it was to tell him to sit down or eat his food or stop fidgeting. There were times when he'd try to speak, to fill the empty space with words, but his voice never seemed to reach their ears. It was always drowned out by the sound of the TV or the clink of silverware. Sometimes he wondered if he was invisible. His eyes lifted back to his drawings. They were the only thing that kept him company. He bent over his latest one, pressing hard on the crayons, trying to make the sky more blue, the grass more green. But the colors barely showed up on the paper. The crayon broke his hand, snapping clean in two, and Liam let out a sigh. He reached for a different color, yellow this time, and traced the outline of a sun in the corner of his paper. A small one. Too small, really. But he didn't mind. He wanted to draw it big, but the sun always felt like it was fading away. So he made it tiny, to match how small he felt in the world. The world outside his room was so big, and he was so small. He could feel it in his chest. This hollow space had seemed to stretch forever. A noise in the corner of the room made him freeze. The floorboard creaked. Liam's head snapped up, his heart thumping in his chest. He had been alone for hours, but now someone, or something, was here. He tried to ignore the chill running down his spine. It was probably just the house settling, the way it always did at this time. The shadows in the corners of the room always seemed to grow longer as the sun disappeared behind the trees, stretching across the wall like fingers creeping closer. But there was something else. Something different. Liam's eyes wandered back to the drawings on his wall, but now the colors seemed even more muted. They weren't just faded. They were wrong. They were moving. He blinked, unsure if he was imagining it. His stomach tightened, a knot forming in his gut. He rubbed his eyes again and looked at the wall, but nothing had changed. Or had it? A voice, soft like wind through leaves, brushed against his ear. "Liam." His breath caught in his throat. He looked around the room, but no one was there. The door was closed, the curtains were still, and his toys were scattered across the floor in a familiar chaos. Yet that voice, her voice, was there again, whispering his name like it had always been there, like it had always been waiting. "Liam." He wasn't sure if he should answer. His thoughts tumbled over each other, too fast to follow. His heart raced and his mouth went dry. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't even know what a ghost was. But this was different. This felt like something that was real, something that was for him. He turned slowly, the floor creaking under his feet as he reached for the edge of the bed. He wasn't alone anymore. He could feel it now. A presence in the room. The air around him thick with something that wasn't there before. Something warm, but also cold. Something waiting. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling, but he knew no one would answer, except for the voice that was already there. "I'm here, Liam." Liam spun, but again nothing. Only the drawings, the one he'd made, staring back at him. But one of them. The sky in the picture seemed a little darker, the sun a little too bright, and the edges of the grass, those once dull, lifeless green streaks, seemed to bend, almost alive in the fading light. The air around him shifted again, and his pulse quickened. He took a step forward, his feet dragging across the carpet as he neared the drawing of the field, a field that never existed, not outside his window. And there she was. She was standing in the picture now, just behind the lines of grass, her figure almost glowing with an eerie kind of light. She had no face at first, just a swirl of colors that swam and spun like a vortex of paint. But as he stared, her face emerged slowly, piece by piece, forming the very hues he'd used to create the picture. Her eyes were pools of shifting black, deep and endless, and her smile stretched wider than any smile ever should. It wasn't a friendly smile, not at first, but it wasn't mean either. It was inviting. "I'm Nixie," she whispered, her voice sweet as honey. "I've been waiting for you." Liam swallowed hard. His mind raced. Who was she? What was she? But the question lost the moment his eyes met hers, for in her gaze he saw something he had never seen before. Warmth. It felt real. She felt real. He didn't feel alone anymore. Liam couldn't stop staring at Nixie. She stood just inside the drawing, her hands resting gently at her sides, her head tilted like she was studying him as much as he was studying her. Her eyes, like ink, swallowed the room. And yet they weren't unkind. There was something warm about her, a softness that he hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. It was as if she had always been there, waiting in the shadows of his room, just out of reach. But now she was here, standing right in front of him. "Hi, Nixie," Liam whispered, as if speaking louder would shatter the magic. His heart pounded in his chest. Was this a dream? Was she really here? She didn't answer immediately, but her smile stretched wider like she was savoring the moment. "You can talk to me any time, Liam," she said, her voice sweet like a lullaby. But there was something else hidden there. A pull. Something drawing him closer. "I've been waiting for you. All this time. You're so special." Liam's cheeks flushed. He didn't understand why, but her words made him feel important. Special, like he finally mattered. She didn't look at him like he was just a kid, like his parents did. She looked at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. "I feel like I've been waiting forever too," Liam confessed, his voice quiet. He wasn't sure why he said it, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I don't know what it's like to have someone to talk to." Nixie's eyes softened, if that was possible. Her smile deepened, and she stepped closer to the edge of the drawing, her form bending and shifting like liquid paint. "That's why I'm here," she said, her voice soothing, her words wrapping around him like a blanket. "I'm your friend, Liam. I've always been here. In your mind, in all of your drawings, even before you could see me. You just had to find me." Liam's throat tightened. He felt a lump swell in his chest. How could she have always been here? He didn't remember her, at least not consciously. But the thought that she'd been there, hiding, waiting for him, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The days that followed blurred together in a soft haze of wondering companionship. Every morning, as the first light slipped through the blinds and painted thin lines across his bedroom floor, Nixie was there. At first, just in the corner of his drawings, watching quietly. But as the days passed, she grew bolder. She slipped from the confines of her world on paper, stepping into his room like she was meant to be there all along. She was always so gentle with him, her presence soft like the shadows at dusk. She never spoke in a hurry, never raised her voice, always careful, as if she were savoring every second with him. There were afternoons when she'd appear out of nowhere, sitting at the edge of his bed watching him draw. "You've gotten better, Liam," she'd murmur, her voice so light it seemed to float on the air. "Your world is beautiful." Liam would smile, a shy thing at first, but it came more easily with each passing day. "It's better with you in it," he'd reply, his words full of a quiet certainty. No one else had ever said anything like that to him. It felt true, like he wasn't just the forgotten boy in the house, but someone important, someone seen. In the evenings, when the house grew quieter and the last remnants of sunlight bled into the sky, Liam would bring Nixie into his world more fully. He'd draw for hours, his hand guided by the rhythm of the pencil as he filled the page with impossible scenes. Mountains that touched the stars, oceans that reflected the moon, animals with wings and eyes full of wonder. Nixie would lean over his shoulder, her fingers trailing along the edges of the page, guiding him, helping him create these masterpieces. "You could come into these," she'd whisper, her voice a tempting hum. "You could be part of this world, Liam. Just imagine what we could create together." Her suggestion would hang in the air between them, an invitation so sweet it made his pulse quicken. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. He was happy with their little games. their secret world of paper and ink? One afternoon, she told him to close his eyes. When he did, the room around him shifted. He felt the warmth of sunlight on his face, the rush of soft wind brushing against his skin. When he opened his eyes, he was standing at the edge of a vast field, the colors of a setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Flowers bright and unreal dotted the grass, swaying in rhythm with the breeze. It felt like a dream, a place where he could just be, where nothing else mattered. "Do you like it?" Nixie asked, her smile both playful and tender as she twirled in the field, her long, dark hair billowing around her like smoke. Liam nodded, speechless for a moment. "It's perfect." And it was. It was perfect because it was theirs. It didn't matter that no one else could see this world, that it didn't exist anywhere else. All that mattered was that Nixie had made it for him, just for him. A world where no one could hurt him. No one could ignore him. Nixie pulled him along, laughing as they ran together, the laughter echoing through the empty field like a song. They played in the fields, picked flowers that glowed like fireflies, and danced beneath the wide purple sky. Time lost meaning in this world. Hours felt like minutes, and Liam didn't care. He was with Nixie, and that was all that mattered. As the days passed, the line between his reality and the world Nixie showed him blurred. He couldn't wait for his time with her, couldn't wait to sit in his room, drawing more, imagining more, until she could bring it to life with her touch. Nixie's presence filled the empty spaces in his heart. Whenever he sat at the window, staring out at the world that always seemed so distant, she'd be there to gently pull him back, her voice like a soft thread winding around him. "Don't look out there," she'd say, her fingers brushing his cheek as she'd materialize next to him. "There's nothing for you out there. It's better here, with me." And he believed her. He began to draw less for the fun of it and more for the future. He sketched buildings, places he could live, homes with gardens full of color, filled with people who would never leave him. He drew himself standing beside Nixie, both of them free, flying through the air, unburdened by the weight of the real world. One evening, she took his hand and led him to the drawing of a small house he'd sketched weeks ago. She leaned down to press her fingers against the page, and the house began to pulse with life, the doors creaking open, the windows sparkling like stars. "See, Liam?" she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "This is where we can live, together, in a place where no one can hurt you, a world where you're not alone." Liam stood frozen for a moment, his chest tight with the enormity of her words. She was offering him everything. He could stay here forever with her. His fingers tingled with the thought of stepping into the drawing, of walking into the world she made for him. It was tempting, so tempting. "I don't want to be alone anymore," he said softly, barely recognizing the aching truth in his own words. Nixie smiled, and it was a smile that made his heart flutter and his stomach twist with something he couldn't name. "You won't be, Liam. You won't ever be alone again. You have me." And in that moment, Liam believed her. He had found someone who understood him, who saw him, who wanted to take him somewhere better, somewhere where he wasn't forgotten. But beneath the surface of her sweet words, something darker stirred. He couldn't see it, not yet. But Nixie's smile grew ever wider, and her eyes glinted with a secret, a promise of something that could last forever. The world outside Liam's window began to blur into the background, a distant memory of places he no longer cared to be. He no longer watched the kids playing outside, their laughter a sound that seemed so foreign to him, so uninviting. All that mattered was Nixie, and all that mattered was a world they could build together, a world where no one would ever forget him again. But the days felt different now. There was a weight to them that hadn't been there before. It wasn't Nixie that had changed, not exactly. It was more that her presence had become heavier. She was always there, of course, by his side when he woke, beside him in the quiet of the night, her voice constantly filling the empty spaces that used to echo with silence. Liam didn't mind. He needed her. He had nothing else. Still, there were moments now, brief flashes when he'd feel an uncomfortable twinge in his chest, something he couldn't place, like a whisper at the back of his mind that warned him to look closer, to be more careful. But those moments were fleeting, quickly swallowed by the warmth of Nixie's smile and the softness of her words. She would always pull him back, tell him to focus on the good, on their perfect world together. "You're perfect here," she'd say, her voice so sweet it was almost impossible to resist. "I'll make sure you always feel perfect. Just step in with me, Liam, and everything will be like this. Forever." It was tempting. So tempting. He had walked into the worlds that they created together multiple times, but the way she was saying it now made it feel different. Like she was asking permission for something. Liam found himself drawn deeper into the world she created for him. The drawings he made grew more intricate, more detailed. Houses, fields, towns where everyone looked just like him and Nixie. Places where there were no rules, no deadlines, no expectations. A place where time didn't matter. A place where he could just be. But one night, as he sat in the dim light of his bedroom, sketching yet another dream world, something shifted. The paper beneath his hand began to feel cold, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, bending in ways they hadn't before. Nixie stood behind him, just out of reach, her fingers grazing the air as if she were waiting for something. Watching. Waiting. "Liam." Her voice was softer now, more coaxing. "Do you trust me?" He glanced over his shoulder and her smile was wide, the kind of smile that made his heart race. "Of course I trust you," he replied without hesitation. The words felt natural, even though they tasted strange on his tongue. It's like something he'd repeated too many times before. She knelt down beside him, her presence enveloping him, her fingers brushing against his drawings, coaxing them to life. "Then you'll come with me. You'll leave this place behind and we'll go somewhere better. Somewhere where nothing can hurt you." Liam's breath caught in his throat. The idea was so sweet, so comforting. For the first time in so long, he felt an overwhelming pull. A desire to just be done with the real world, with the house that never seemed to care for him, with the empty rooms and the silence that filled every corner. "What if I don't want to leave?" he whispered, unsure of his own question. The thought hung in the air like a fragile thread, and for a moment, he didn't know why he'd said it. Nixie's smile faltered for the briefest moment before returning, even wider, as if she'd known this moment would come. "You won't want to leave once you see what I've created for you," she said, her voice like a soft breeze, coaxing him into the warmth of her arms. "You'll be perfect in this world, Liam. I've made it all for you, and it's waiting for you." The room and the air thickened and the walls seemed to close in. Liam's pulse quickened and his mind swam in a haze of possibilities. Could he really leave everything behind? Could he step into this world she created where he would never be alone again? Her fingers traced the edges of his drawing. A doorway now, one that pulsed with a strange, inviting light. He hadn't drawn it, but there it was, standing in the middle of his page, glowing softly, beckoning him. Liam's fingers twitched, hovering just above the paper. The world beyond the door was bright, too bright to ignore. The colors seemed to swirl as if calling him, pulling him toward them. "You'll never be alone again," Nixie whispered, her voice so soft it seemed to crawl into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts. "All you have to do is step through." And as the door shimmered before him, as the world beyond it seemed to stretch out into eternity, Liam felt something stir inside him. A deep, insistent longing to belong somewhere, anywhere, as long as it was with Nixie. Her hand brushed against his cheek, her touch light and tender. "Come with me, Liam. It'll be like this forever. Just step through and we'll never have to leave." His fingers moved almost of their own accord toward the page. The world beyond the door seemed to pulse with life, and Liam felt a strange warmth fill his chest. There was nothing else in his life. No friends, no family that cared about him, no comfort. Just Nixie. Just the promise of a place where he could be perfect, where he wouldn't ever have to feel lost again. He looked into Nixie's eyes, her smile wide and full of secrets. "I trust you," he whispered. And in that moment, he stepped forward. His foot hovered over the page. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on him, and he stepped through. The world around him shifted. The room grew dark, the edges of the walls vanishing into the void. And then, with a soft thud, his foot met solid ground. The warmth of Nixie's presence surrounded him, and he felt the world settle beneath his feet. He was inside the drawing, inside the world they created, and all at once, the colors seemed to flood back into his mind, bright and overwhelming. And as the door behind him closed, sealing him into a world of her making, Nixie's laughter echoed through the air. A sound that wasn't quite like laughter at all. It was something darker, something that felt like the last thing he would ever hear. Liam's first step into the world beyond the door was nothing like he'd imagined. The colors, so vibrant and alluring at first, began to shift, began twisting in ways that made his stomach turn. He blinked, trying to focus, but the scenery around him seemed to bend and blur. What had once been a playful landscape, rolling hills, endless skies, the bright smile of Nixie beside him, became something more ominous, more suffocating. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, like mud, but it shifted with every step he took, as though the earth itself was watching him. Nixie stood just ahead, waiting, her smile as wide as ever. But there was something different now. Her eyes, once sparkling with warmth, were now dark. Pools of shadow that seemed to reach into him, pulling at his very soul. Her laughter, once melodic and comforting, echoed with an eerie undertone that made Liam's heart race. "I told you it'd be perfect here," she said, her voice a caress. But there was no warmth in it anymore, only a cold, hollow echo. Liam looked around, his mind trying to grasp what had happened. Where were the fields? Where was the place he'd imagined they'd play together forever? Instead, the sky above was a sickly shade of purple, swirling and pulsing like a bruise. The trees, if they could even be called that, were twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers scratching at the sky. The ground, too, seemed wrong, as if it were alive, shifting and groaning beneath his feet. Nixie stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something darker, something far less innocent than he had ever imagined. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" she asked, her voice soft but heavy with something terrible. Liam took a step back, confusion clouding his thoughts. I don't understand. You said we'd be together forever." Her smile widened, stretching too far across her face, as if it could split her head in two. "Oh, we will be. But it's different here, Liam. It's not just you and me anymore. This world, it's mine. I created it. And now, you're just another piece of it." Her laughter echoed around him, louder now, filling the space like a distant storm. Liam's heart raced. The warmth he had once felt in her presence was gone, replaced by an oppressive chill. He spun in place, desperate for an escape. But the world around him stretched endlessly in all directions, a kaleidoscope of nightmarish color. The more he looked, the more he realized there was no way out. "You can't leave now," Nixie said softly, almost kindly, as if explaining the obvious. You entered my world willingly, and now you're a part of it. Forever. Just like the others before you.
Liam's breath caught in his throat as his eyes were allowed a glimpse of the real world. They fell on the easel by his bedside, on the painting that had drawn him in, the one that had once seemed like a doorway to happiness, now warped and twisted like the world around him. The faces of children, frozen in smiles, their eyes vacant and hollow. His own face was among them, a lifeless, painted version of himself, trapped in the same eternal grin.
You wanted to be perfect,
Nixie whispered, her voice low and sweet, as she moved toward him.
Now you are, but you'll never leave. Not now, not ever.
Liam felt the realization crush down on him, a weight heavier than any he'd ever known. His body felt cold, as though the world itself was leeching his warmth away and he couldn't breathe. The reality of his decision, of stepping into this place, hit him like a wave. He had been so desperate, so lonely, he hadn't even questioned what she really wanted. Tears welled up in his eyes as he turned to her, but her face remained unchanged.
Please,
he begged, his voice a whisper in the endless, colorless void.
I don't want this. I don't want to be here. Let me go.
Nixie tilted her head, her smile unchanging, and she raised her hand, tracing the air as though she were drawing invisible shapes around him. The world around him seemed to shift again. The colors that had once filled him with excitement and wonder were now cold and suffocating, a prison of endless hues. There was no escape, no hope, no future. Liam took a step back, his hand shaking as he touched his chest.
I didn't mean to.
His voice trailed off, his words swallowed by the endless stretch of color and shadow. Nixie's eyes glittered with something unreadable.
It doesn't matter now. You're mine. You'll always be mine. You'll never be alone again. You'll never forget me. Not ever.
And as Liam stood there, trapped in the swirling void of color, he realized the full extent of his mistake. The hope he had once felt, the promise of something better, had been nothing but a lie. As Liam listened to the haunting words of Nixie, his body began to stiffen. He bore a pained smile on his face and was trapped forever in a world of never-ending hues. Liam's final thought echoed in the silence.
I should have stayed in the real world, no matter how lonely it was.
But it was too late. The search had been endless. For 3 years, Liam's parents looked, printed missing person flyers, called every police station, and begged anyone who would listen. They never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, even as the trail grew colder and their hearts heavier. But there were no answers. Every day, they lived with the guilt that perhaps they weren't paying enough attention. Maybe if they had noticed the signs, if they had been more present, their son wouldn't have disappeared without a trace. Their home, once filled with the sounds of his laughter and the weight of his presence, became a place of suffocating silence. Each room seemed to hold memories of what was no longer there. His toys lay forgotten in the corner, his bed untouched, and the walls held the echoes of his absence. 3 years later, they couldn't bear the weight of it any longer. The house, their home, it felt like a graveyard, and it was suffocating them. They sold the house, packed their things, and moved far away, hoping that in a new place, the memories would eventually fade. A new family moved in soon after. They had a young girl, barely 5 years old. Her name was Emma, and she was full of life, excitement, and an innocence that felt like a balm to the house that had seen so much loss. As the night settled in, Emma snuggled into her bed for the first time, the room quiet except for the soft creak of the old house settling around her. She hadn't explored much of the house yet, but something caught her eye that night. A small, faint noise from the back of her closet.
Curiosity led her to the dark corner, where she crouched to peek behind the clothes. There, wedged between two old boxes, was a folded sheet of paper. She picked it up carefully, her tiny fingers brushing the creases away. Unfolding it, she gasped. It was a drawing, a crayon sketch done with childish abandon. On one side was a smiling girl with long hair, her eyes large and filled with joy. Next to her, a boy, his face twisted in fear, his eyes wide as though trapped. Behind them, a vibrant landscape stretched out, colors too bright to be real. But the boy's expression was not one of joy. He was in distress, his hands grasping at the girl's shoulders, his mouth open as if trying to speak but unable to. The girl, Nixie, was laughing, her smile wide, her eyes gleaming with something almost predatory. As Emma stared at the drawing, her heart began to race and her hand trembled. She felt something strange tugging at her, an urge to turn around. But before she could, a voice filled her ears. "Emma, come play with me. I've been waiting." The voice was sweet, melodic, almost like a lullaby. But there was something chilling in the undertone, a promise, a beckoning. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. "Come to me, Emma. I'm waiting, and I have so much fun planned." The drawing slipped from her fingers, drifting to the floor, forgotten for the moment as Emma's eyes darted nervously around the room, her little heart hammering. And as the wind howled faintly outside, she heard it again, clearer this time, wrapping around her like a velvet thread. Come to Nixie." The sound of metal against metal echoed throughout the hall as the cell door shut. Richard Allen Carver took a seat on his tiny cot, placing his bedroll upon it. He buried his pale face in his hands with a sigh. He would have never guessed he would ever be in prison. He mumbled to himself about how stupid it was for him to try to drive home that night from the party, cursing his fate and thinking of how disappointed his family was at his actions. His thoughts were interrupted by a man leaning out from the shadows across from him, an elbow resting against the cot. "How long you got, pal?" The voice was cold, emotionless. Richard looked up from his hands, his eyes coming to rest upon his new cellmate. The man had dark hair that receded at the hairline. Dark wrinkled bags hung under each dim blue-gray eye and thick beard clung to his chin. There was a faint smile playing on the man's lips, but Richard had a terrible feeling that he shouldn't trust him. He had only heard rumors about the kind of people he would meet in there, and he wasn't sure just how true they could be. Not sure yet. Still awaiting trial," Richard responded. The man sat up on his bed, hands clapping down on his knees. "Well, what did you do?" "I was driving home from a party, had a bit to drink, hit this car and some people got hurt." "Is that all?" the man said with a laugh. "Yeah, really don't want to talk about it anymore," Richard said, as he spread out his bedroll and prepared for sleep. The man laid back down, his form fading back into the shadow that hung over that side of the bed. "If you say so. But it gets lonely in here. You're gonna want to talk eventually." The night was filled with random noises that kept Richard awake. When the guards came to retrieve them for breakfast, he struggled to keep his eyes open. This mattered little to the correction officers that pushed him down the hall towards the cafeteria. He was directed through a line and given a metal tray. He slid down the line and attempted to pick something he thought was edible. It was a mash of things he couldn't discern, so he simply took the same thing the person ahead of him had. His tray dropped at an empty table as the masses converged on their claimed property. A few men sat across from him and began talking. They cut their eyes at Richard every time they caught him looking in their direction, which made Richard uneasy. He picked up a roll and broke it in half. The piece of bread had almost touched his lips when he felt an abrupt push against his shoulder. His face turned slowly, his gaze falling on a hulk of a man, covered head to toe in tattoos. Richard learned quickly that there were places you did not sit, and this happened to be one of them.
"That's Bubba's seat. Remember that,"
the smaller of the two heckled. He rose quietly from his seat, the men around him laughing hysterically. He had almost maneuvered around the giant before him when the smaller man slapped the tray from Rick's hands. His food scattered on the floor, the tray clanging like an alarm to everyone within earshot. The rest of the room joined in on Richard's humiliation. He leaned down and picked up his tray and returned it to the station to be cleaned. He simply stood by the exit and waited to be escorted back to his cell. When the door shut on him again, his cellmate leaned forward again to greet him. Richard didn't respond and simply lay back on his bed. He was hungry, but there was nothing he could do for it. The sound of his hunger growled out into the tiny space, and he grasped at it in an attempt to silence it. The man behind him laughed a little, which only made Richard feel worse. He fought back the urge to cry, knowing that he couldn't let himself be seen any more weak than he already had. Richard couldn't afford to put that kind of target on his back. "What's your name?" the man said. Richard hesitated, still not sure he should get close to anyone in here. Richard? "You might want to shorten that to Rick and stop acting like a priss or you're gonna keep having little altercations like that," the man responded. "What do you know?" Richard barked. "Well, I've been in here a long time and I've seen a few things." The voice still seemed to mock Richard. Richard rolled over to his cellmate. "So, what's your name then?" The guy leaned closer and smiled. "Folks call me Pitch." Then he stuck out a hand for a shake. Richard let his hand rest in Pitch's, shaking it. The grip had been far stronger than he imagined. When he released, his hand felt like ice. Richard rubbed at his fingers for a moment, looking Pitch up and down. He still didn't feel like he could trust this guy, but maybe he could at least talk to him. It would get boring fast if he kept to himself the whole time. Richard faked a smile and leaned back on his bed while Pitch went back to reading a book in silence. Later that day, during their yard time, Richard walked past most of the groups and attempted to keep to himself. Eyes watched him intently. Murmurs erupted from tightly knit groups of men. Richard tried to listen, but he could barely make out a word. None of them approached, and some of them seemed to scatter when Richard came within a few feet of him. The whole yard seemed to have their eyes on the newest inmate, but he had no idea why. That night before lights out, the guards came to Richard's cell, removing him from it and began tossing his things about. He was told they were looking for contraband and that if they found anything, he was being sent down to solitary. They found nothing in his cot, but there was a sharpened toothbrush hidden within the stuffing of Pitch's pillow. Richard was instantly cuffed and taken to confinement, begging for an explanation the whole way. He insisted that the toothbrush wasn't his and that it belonged to his cellmate. The guards laughed at the notion and tossed Richard into an even smaller cell. He pounded on the door and demanded to be let out, but he received no response. The following day, Richard was escorted to a conference room where his attorney was waiting. He sat across from the well-dressed man and immediately asked for information regarding the trial. He learned at that moment his date had been pushed back due to additional charges. Richard's eyes grew wide as his attorney detailed how he had been charged with the attempted murder of a fellow inmate, a Brian Bubba Wells. He instantly began denying the allegations, stating that it had not been him but his cellmate Pitch. He screamed that the guards had found the weapon in the other man's bunk but shoved him into solitary. His attorney assured him that he would investigate the claims and do his best to absolve him of the alleged crime. When Richard was allowed back to his cell, Pitch lay on his bunk reading another book. His cellmate looked up at Richard as he entered. Richard waited for the guards to leave and slowly took a seat across from Pitch. His mind swirled with possible reactions. He wanted to be angry and he wanted to know what was going on, but he couldn't fly off the handle. If Pitch had really stabbed Bubba, then there was no reason he wouldn't do something similar to him. "Why'd you try to kill Bubba?" Richard finally said.
"I don't like bullies,"
Pitch said as he peered over his book. "Why do they think I did it?"
"Haven't the foggiest idea,"
Pitch said, not seeming concerned as he turned a page. This wasn't a good enough answer for Richard, but he doubted he would get the truth. He simply turned away from his cellmate and tried to sleep. It took hours, laying there listening to the rustling of the pages of Pitch's book. The sound seemed to grow louder the longer he listened. It echoed in his head until Pitch finally sat the book back down and went to sleep himself. Richard was finally able to doze off not long after, his mind still consumed by confusion. Over the next few weeks, the rumors spread, and within a month, Richard had become the biggest monster within Cade County Prison. The rumors even leaked through to the guards, and Richard found himself being transferred to D Block, which housed some of the worst criminals imaginable. And Pitch waved goodbye with a sickly grin as Richard exited the room he had called home for the last month. He was placed in a cell by himself, the men around him keeping their distance. He took a seat on his new bunk, seeing the one across from him empty. He sat quietly among their whispers and curious stares for a while before a scrawny-looking man across the hall called out to him.
"Psst, hey you!"
Richard didn't even look up. "What?"
"Did you really just kill your last cellmate?"
"No, and I didn't stab Bubba," Richard said in an irritated tone.
"Not what I've heard,"
the man said, a smirk rising from one side of his mouth. "You shouldn't believe everything you hear," Richard replied, before turning to lay back on his bunk. That night, as Richard lay staring at the ceiling of his dark cell, a noise like a dripping faucet caught his attention. He turned to the small sink across from him, but there was no water. The water within the commode bowl showed no sign of movement. He leaned closer to be sure, and from the other side of the room, Pitch dove from the adjacent bunk. The man's body landed heavy over Richard, pinning him to the bed. He screamed for help, but no one came, and Pitch simply smiled as he lowered himself toward Richard's face. Dark droplets slowly trickled from Pitch's nose and eyes. It rolled down his face before dropping onto Richard's. When Richard had thought that the horror had reached its peak, Pitch's mouth opened and a shower of the same black fluid was released all over Richard's mouth. Richard tumbled from his bunk, still gagging and trying to catch his breath. He searched the room, but Pitch wasn't within it. When he searched his bed, there was no sign of the black substance that he was sure had been vomited all over him just seconds before. He looked out from the cell, asking anyone who could hear him if they had seen Pitch just moments ago. He only received angry insults and impolite suggestions to go back to bed. Richard sat back on his bunk, rubbing at his temples. He thought for a moment and decided it must have been a nightmare. He laid back down and tried to sleep, but the scene kept playing through his head. He was still staring at the ceiling when the guards came to retrieve him for breakfast. Within the mess hall, a group of men was harassing a new inmate. Richard collected his food and watched from across the room. A feeling of pure rage bubbled up inside him as he watched them shove a small man around the cafeteria and toss his food in the trash. Before he could think, he was across the room and driving his metal tray deep into the side of the head of one man. His left foot arose and dropped hard against the kneecap of another, sending both crumpling to the floor. The remaining men ran in fear as Richard stood over the one who had been attacked. The man looked just as afraid of Richard as the others, but he thanked his rescuer for the help. As Richard turned to walk away, he felt liquid seep down from his nose. When he wiped it with the back of his hand, it revealed an inky black smear. When he returned to his cell, the tiny book that Pitch had always been reading lay neatly on his pillow. He lifted it slowly, noticing no distinguishing marks or lettering. It was simply a black leather-bound book with yellowing pages between. He opened it to the first page, and another drop of black dripped from his nose. It splashed upon the pages, splintering out onto the blank page before him. He turned the page and noticed that every page was blank as he wiped at his nose again. When he returned to the first page, his actions within the mess hall had been detailed in its entirety. situations continued to occur that Richard could not seem to avoid being drawn into. His body would instinctively interfere, and each and every time, his nose would bleed black, and every time it would get added to the book. It had become a hobby to keep him entertained within his lonely cell. Richard would smile as he watched the inky liquid move independently and form words upon the page in a neatly scrawled cursive. It didn't take long to fill 10 pages, and he would read them over and over again before the guards would signal for lights out. Eventually, his actions afforded him a transfer to a maximum security prison. Cade County could no longer tolerate his violent nature and decided to hand him over to the federal prison system. As he took a seat within his new cell, he noticed that he was again alone within it. Richard started to feel as though they didn't trust him in a small space with another person. He flipped through the pages again, having filled a half of the book. He wondered what would happen when he reached the end. Would the pages return to blank and he start all over? Or would he need a new book? He pondered this as men within his cell block began to make obscene gestures in his general direction. A sinister smile played on his lips, thinking of the words that would fill his little diary of destruction. Within 6 months, he had made a new name for himself and would be serving 7 consecutive life sentences. Richard no longer cared. He just wanted to keep filling his book. It had become an obsession, and he would sit quietly in his room reading it from until he had an opportunity to strike again and add another page. Richard wanted nothing more than to see what happened when he got to the last page and did everything he possibly could to reach that goal as quickly as he could. He simply had to know the result. His thoughts were interrupted by the door to his cell opening and being gestured to exit for yard time. He smiled, knowing this was an opportunity to add another page or two. When he returned, new pages awaited to be filled after he stabbed 2 gang members with a makeshift knife fashioned from aluminum foil. He took a seat on his bunk and slid back into the shadow that covered it, then opened his book and let the black droplets add to his growing journal. The cell door opened again, a new inmate being placed in the bunk next to him. Richard was scanning over the newly formed words as the man set his bedroll down. Richard looked up over his pages, seeing that the man appeared to be far more dangerous than he. The man laughed at the sight of Richard. "So, this is the monster I keep hearing about." Richard smiled and turned the book to a fresh page. "Yep," he said, without looking up. "You don't look like much of a monster to me. What's your name, anyway?" "Probably something nerdy like Bill or Bob. Maybe even Richard." The man leaned forward, laughing while bits of saliva sprayed his face. Richard thought for a moment, his anger boiling up inside of him. Then a drop of dark liquid fell to the page and formed large letters that read, P-I-T-C-H. "Pitch," he said quietly. "Did you say bitch? I think he just said his name is Bitch," the man yelled out to the cell block, the men around them cowering from the commotion. "I said pitch," Richard screamed into the man's face. As he rose from his bunk, the dark liquid flowing more rapidly from his nose and eyes. "What the?" the man said as Richard drew closer. A few moments later, guards came rushing in to find Richard crumpled on the floor and the new inmate sitting on his bunk, flipping through a tiny black book. They revived Richard and took him to the infirmary to check him for injuries. All of his tests came back fine, and he would be allowed to go back to his cell. That is, after he spoke to his attorney, who happened to be waiting for him in the conference room. The guards directed him to the room and placed him just across the table, still shackled for the protection of everyone within the room. His lawyer spoke. "I'm sorry to inform you that we are going to lose your case. The evidence against you is just too strong. I think you're going to get charged for murder again, Richard." "Murder? What are you talking about? I've never killed anyone," Richard cried, tears flowing from his eyes. "It must have been Pitch. He framed me again." The lawyer rubbed at his eyes, frustrated. That's what you said the first time, Mr. Carver, but your actions within the penal system prove different. Plus, neither this facility or Cade County have any record of an inmate by that name and nickname. You never even had an inmate in your cell with you when you first got here. I even looked up the description you gave, and it don't fit anyone here. But this is impossible. It can't be. I haven't killed anyone, Richard yelled, his hands slamming on the table. The attorney jumped at the action, fear rising up in him. I'm sorry, Mr. Carver. There is nothing more I can do for you, he said, as he quickly gathered his things and rushed from the room. Over the past month or so, I've been researching how to find a monster dating website. It's exactly what it sounds like. If you're one of the lucky few to use the site, you can go on a date with any kind of monster straight from a nightmare with mixed results. I've heard rumors that it's turned out well for some people, but not so much for others. I was determined to find this website. Here I thought hooking up with a werewolf or vampire was just a crazy dream. Now I had a chance. I have no proof of this, but I think the site picks who gets to use its services. People can stumble on it to look, but only the special ones can sign up for the dating part. No one has been able to get a screenshot. Posts have said that the website looks like it's from the early 2000s. It had a section on the front page with profiles of creatures to date. They get booked up so quickly that it's better to fill out the blind dating profile. Since the website is only up for a few minutes after midnight, I didn't want to risk getting kicked off while trying to find the perfect monster to date. I wasn't picky. Any creature would do. It took me weeks of clicking around on forums and dead links to finally find it. My heart was racing when a random friend request showed up through a Discord a few minutes before midnight. The username was a string of numbers and letters. The only message was a link. It's not a good idea to click random links, but I was willing to nuke my computer for this chance. I waited until the clock rolled over and quickly opened the website. My hand shook from excitement as I flew to the dating profile page, ignoring the homepage. I wish I could be faster to sign up for a date or two with some of the monsters displayed. The low-res images showing cute girls with cat ears disappear within a few seconds, as they were instantly booked up. Another theory that's been put out there is the idea of this website catering to parallel universes. It would explain where all these monsters come from and how so many were booked for dates without it becoming mainstream news. The blind dating profile was simple. It asked for your name, phone number and email address, and ideal date. There was also a drop-down menu hidden near the bottom of the page asking for your preferred species. There were no promises you'd get what you asked for, but if a creature you wanted was free, then that's who they'd send first. I filled out my name and phone number, then went straight to the drop-down menu. I only had a minute before the site went down. I did want to pick werewolf from the menu, but it was in alphabetical order. And there were a lot of options. If I tried scrolling that far down, I would use up all my time. Most of the creatures' names I didn't recognize. But a word caught my eye. A hybrid. Would werewolves count as a hybrid monster? They were a human and a wolf mixed, so maybe. I clicked that and submitted my request moments before I got kicked off the site. I held my breath, waiting and praying. People reported getting a text shortly after applying. Some got one even if they hadn't put in their cell phone number, and yet they got the message about a date. It felt like time was moving in slow motion when finally, a text from an unknown number came through. It had a photo of a stop sign at the end of the street I lived on saying my date would meet me there at 11 p.m. on Friday. The Discord message disappeared, and there was no history of the dating website on my browser. I knew this was legit. I grabbed my phone and replied to the text asking if the date could happen sooner. I think no one had ever sent such a message back to the mysterious number. I could almost feel the confusion through the phone. A few minutes passed, and another set of texts came through. "Does 11 p.m. on Wednesday work for you?" they asked. I wanted to press my luck and ask for anything sooner than that, but I accepted that time. The messages disappeared from my phone, leaving no traces behind of what I agreed to. I was immensely excited. How couldn't I be? I've heard horror stories about people getting ripped apart by their so-called dates, or get stuck in a relationship where they always needed to watch their backs. I knew the risks going in, and I was fine accepting death if that also meant I may be able to experience a goal I thought would be impossible. I arrived early and started pacing on the spot waiting for my date to show up. I realized there hadn't been a choice to pick the gender of who you would be meeting, but with creatures, gender was tricky. I mean, what if your date was a blob monster? Do blobs even have genders? Do vampires even care if you call them a guy or a girl? Honestly, I was fine with whatever. Being picky with gender feels silly when you're down to be with a creature made up of dark fur and teeth. The person who arrived appeared somewhat normal aside from the large brown trench coat in the summer heat. He was taller than me by 2 feet, but his face looked a few years younger than I was. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, after he stopped near the stop sign. We were a little bit away from the streetlight. Shadows played over his face, giving away a hint of the monster he really was behind his human face. I think I'm waiting for you. I'm Clay," I said, as I held out my hand for him to shake. It took him a second to figure out a handshake, which was a little cute. He had long, dark, wavy hair that almost looked purple in the dim light. "I'm called Saren," he said, and smiled, showing off unnaturally pointed teeth. My heart fluttered with a mixture of fear and excitement. It was the same feeling as waiting in line for a roller coaster. The bottom of the trench coat moved in an odd way that drew my eyes downwards. I had picked hybrid, but I couldn't see his feet. Was his bottom a half human or something else? Would it be rude to ask what was under the coat? I felt my face flush when I realized I might be expecting a bit too much out of a first date. "My place is just down the street. Do you want to come over?" I asked, feeling suddenly flustered. "How bold of you to invite me over. Someone would think you may have certain motives in mind," Saren teased. I found myself at a loss for words. Yeah, that was the goal of this date. But when the option was directly in front of me, I found myself fumbling. "We can just hang out. We don't need to rush into anything," I weakly defended myself. He smiled again, but this time his expression lost any charm his face held. The monster he was came out as he started to open his coat. A sound started from under the fabric. It was one I couldn't place, but it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, this date didn't seem as fun as I expected it was going to be. "I don't mind rushing into things. In fact, I like you so much I don't even want to wait to get inside." A flash of motion came from under his coat, and I felt a pressure wrap around my body. My arms were pinned tightly and I was barely able to breathe. My heart dropped in horror as countless legs moved around me, making more of that terrible sound that made the inside of my skull itch. Saren's bottom half wasn't anything remotely close to human. Somehow, he had tucked away an insanely long black centipede body under his coat. At that moment, I didn't care about how he accomplished such a feat. My brain was too fried from fear of the situation I found myself in. I thought I would have been fine with death. I expected that outcome. But I never would have thought creatures like him were out there. His smile grew when he saw my fearful expression and felt my body shake under his. His legs didn't stop moving as his body kept wrapped around mine, the tips of his legs quickly moving against my exposed arms. I jolted under the weight when a set of legs looked at my shirt for a second. I won't be able to hold back devouring a cute little thing like yourself. It won't hurt too much, though," he whispered, his face getting closer to my own. I shook my head, my throat closing up, causing only a whimper to come out. This wasn't what I wanted at all. His teeth were about to come down to rip away my ear when I finally was able to yell. "Get your gross, creepy legs off of me!" I shouted, and shut my eyes tight. The movement stopped. Dogs in the distance started to bark, and I thankfully didn't have to listen to the sounds of his legs constantly crawling. Carefully, I opened my eyes to take a peek in his direction. I thought he would have been angry or even amused by my outburst. Instead, he looked like someone had slapped him across the face. The grip lessened, and he drew his body away, hiding it again under his coat. Guilt started in my stomach. A neighbor came outside to quiet his dog. I didn't want someone to see us, so I took him by the wrist to drag him down the street to my place. Sure, it wasn't the best idea to let him know where I lived. The air of danger around him disappeared as he slumped against my couch. His face buried into the cushions, and he let his long body sprawl out over the floor. Do you want to pick up where we left off?" I offered nervously. Saren shook his head, still pressed into the cushion. "I'm not in the mood." I sat down next to him, feeling like a jerk. Sure, he was going to eat me, but that doesn't mean I should have insulted him. I did sign up for this date, knowing the possible outcomes, and yet I acted like this. "Do you find my body disgusting?" he suddenly asked in a moody voice after he lifted his head. "What? No," I partly lied. His top half was super cute. His pointed legs scuttled, causing my shoulders to tense up, revealing my lie. "I was just surprised, that's all." I tried defending myself with hands raised. Saren frowned disappointed over how the night was going. His body curled itself inwards, showing just how emotional he was under the surface. "It's always like this. Everyone's fine being frisky with a monster until I show up. People pick a hybrid hoping for a dog man or a human with animal features. I've worked so hard to become a terrifying monster only to have your kind be disgusted by my body." I really felt bad. This poor guy had issues, and I wasn't helping at all. I wasn't sure what to say to make the situation better. Werewolves and dogmen are popular in media, so a lot of people think they're hot. Maybe we just need more exposure to your kind of creature? I suggested. His cheeks puffed up for a second, and his legs twitched in agitation. His face turned a slight shade of red as he refused to look at me. "If you think dogs are hot, just get one and don't sign up for a monster dating website," he huffed. I didn't hide my disgust at the suggestion. There's a difference, okay?" I said, shaking my head. "How so? I think a human sleeping with a werewolf is crossing a line. At least I have the upper half of a human and the same kind of..." Saren stopped himself before he said something a bit too crude. His face turned an even deeper shade of red as he pressed his face back into the cushions, mortified over what he was about to talk about. He had a large, baggy sweater on under his trench coat, so I wasn't able to see what it looked like when his human half met his insect half. I knew I should have dropped it, but I couldn't help myself. "How many dates before I get to see what you're working with?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. He let out a muffled scream, his head shooting up and his eyes filled with embarrassed tears. "I never should have agreed to this. Your kind is horrible. Only good for food. I can't believe I put in so much effort to get my body looking like this," he hissed out. Okay, I was still acting like a huge jerk. I let him calm down for a minute. I'm fairly sure I traumatized him a little, even though he was the monster in the room. "I'm sorry I embarrassed you," I started, and saw him pout and turn his head. I went into this date with some pretty crude expectations. I wanted to meet a monster that would get too excited during a passionate meeting and eat me, ideally after the passion part. Saren's cheeks were still pink, but he was curious about my reasoning. I think most people would judge me for my ideal way to die. Even a monster sitting next to me seemed confused. You want to get eaten in the middle of... He found it too embarrassing to finish the question out loud. Why? The word spilled out and he instantly regretted asking. I smiled at him, fully understanding his confusion. I felt bad he got stuck with me that night. I have a disease that will cause my body to lose functions over time. I've seen my relatives die from it, and I don't want to end up like them. I wanted to go out on my own terms, but I also wanted my body to be used for something. I heard horror stories about people donating their bodies to science, then getting blown up in experiments, I explained, and gave him a little bit to let the information sink in. I don't understand how you decided on mating with a werewolf and letting it eat you, Saren said with a raised eyebrow. Not just a werewolf. I'd be happy with any other sexy monster, I corrected, and then mentally kicked myself. Saren curled his body in tighter, taking my words as an insult. I had rejected him earlier, and now I admitted I didn't find him attractive. Well, his top half was easy on the eyes. His bottom half was mentally harder to get used to. He let out a sigh, accepting that this date was a disaster. I suppose we're both stuck with a body that causes us problems. At least I was able to do something about mine. When I was born, I was a simple millipede. As I ate more human flesh, I gained this appearance. After all that hard work, I'm stuck with a form people turn away from. Again, a guilty feeling came to my stomach. You know, it was just the sounds that were gross. I was honestly scared when you wrapped around me. I think you're very talented at being a dark and scary monster people would have nightmares about. Saren looked a bit embarrassed over getting some unexpected praise. He wasn't fully agreeing with the statements, but he didn't ask me to stop. I looked back at his many legs, now correcting myself that he was a millipede and not a centipede. I suppose millipedes could be cute in the right light. I carefully placed a hand on one of the segments, feeling how smooth and warm it was. His back stiffened, but he didn't protest. I wanted to salvage this night for him, or at the very least, make Saren feel better about himself. How about you try scaring me again? I offered. He shook his head, being stubborn. I decided to use a different tactic. We are on a date. We could do date-related things. You're just desperate to live out your weird fetish and get in my pants. Why don't you track down a stupid dog man for that? I only kiss on the first date. I don't put out. I'm not that easy, I corrected, offended. Those words made him perk up. I felt a small tremble go down his body as his legs clicked away at the carpet. You think my legs are gross, he muttered, mostly to himself. I think he wanted affection from someone as much as he wanted a free meal. I could at least give him one of those things. We should try exposure therapy. After a while, I won't feel grossed out by the noises. I'll just be scared of you. I was freaked out earlier, so it's not as if you're not scary. Saren made some noises as if he was facing a hard choice. It took a lot of fidgeting until he felt comfortable to bring his face closer to mine. He pointed to his cheek and permitted me to kiss it. A noise came from him that sounded like it was from a high school girl. A ripple went down his body as his legs tapped away. The sound gave me goosebumps and raised all the hair on my arms. But, weirdly, the reaction had also been a little bit cute. He permitted a few more cheek kisses with the same kind of reaction. Just as I thought I was getting past the whole leg thing, his body suddenly wrapped around mine. Each leg tip dug into my skin, The weight compressed my lungs for a second. His millipede body started to move around, expanding and tightening to let me breathe enough so I wouldn't pass out. I'm sure there was someone out there who would have enjoyed this, but I didn't. I was scared as hell. Saren took hold of my face, his starving monster side showing itself. He wasn't able to hold back from nipping and biting saw parts of my face and neck. Again, I bet someone out there would have loved this, but my heart raced in fear that his teeth just needed to bite down slightly harder to end my life. My mind raced, wanting this to end, but I kept my mouth shut. No matter how scared I was, I refused to upset a poor monster I called over for a date. I brought all of this onto myself and I needed to face it. It felt like years I had been wrapped in that terrifying hold. It was only an hour. Saren misjudged his strength and wrapped it around too tightly for too long. Stars danced in the dark, and I passed out for a few minutes. I woke up on the floor to him gently tapping my face to see if I was still alive. My body was bruised and my lips were sore from his teeth. I stayed on the ground and asked him to come closer, which he did. When he was within striking distance, I kissed his cheek, which mortified him enough to be revenge for the still lingering feeling of his legs crawling over me. When I was able to sit up again, Saren gathered his coat, saying it was about time for him to leave. He patiently helped me get up and see him to the door. We awkwardly stood as he tucked his long body away, ready to disappear into the night. If you find the website again and request a date a week before the full moon, you have a better chance of getting a werewolf, he told me, as he lingered near the door. I think I changed my mind about how I want to go out, I admitted. He frowned, most likely regretting ever trying to speak with a human, let alone go on a date with one. I think I would rather get eaten by a super cute monster after we've had a few dates and I've gotten to know them better, I said, nodding. Saren shrugged, thinking back to the website and what creature he knew that could fit that description. I mean, you could try putting that in your profile, but I think all the creatures humans think are cute get booked up too fast, he said, shaking his head. Does that mean you're not free this Friday? His entire body froze as my words sank in. His mouth opened and closed a few times like a fish trying to think of a response. I laughed at his reaction, which was not something he wanted to hear. I'm supposed to be terrifying, a man-eating beast, something that you don't want to encounter at night. I should have humans frozen in fear at the sight of me, and you. He hissed, frustrated, which made me laugh more. You can be all those things and cute. He froze again, his eyes narrowed, trying to spot a lie. You're super scary. If you're lying to me, I'll make you regret it, Saren replied, voice low and dark. See? That's scary, I pointed out. He straightened up, folded his arms, appearing proud of himself. And now you're cute. His reaction was to give my shoulder a hard shove. I heard something crack as a bolt of pain shot directly into my brain. He didn't break anything, but he could have. I rubbed my sore arm, fighting back a pain reaction so he didn't know how much damage he did. Friday? I asked, trying to confirm another date regardless of what just happened. I might just eat you before you get any action, Saren said, still sounding a little upset with me. I'm fine with that. We won't do anything you're not comfortable with. He shook his head and tightened his coat around his neck, then hid half his face inside. Then he spoke some words I never thought I would hear from another person, let alone a monster that wanted to eat me. You should value your life more. That time I was the one stunned into silence. For so long, I assumed my life was meaningless because I wouldn't last long. I only had a few years at most, so who cares about anything I've ever done? I was never someone important, or at least I've always treated myself in that way. My hand shot out to take his. We were both surprised at my reaction. I want to be scared. I'm scared of death, but not enough to stay away from it. I think if we spend more time together, I'll value the time I have left. I know it's asking a lot of you, but can you scare me? My chest hurt. I couldn't believe I asked such a huge thing from someone I just met. Saren was a stranger. He had no obligation to stay with me. And yet he started to slowly nod his head. He was determined to make me afraid. He didn't care if I was scared that he was a monster, or scared that I wouldn't be with him forever. I need to go before I rip something off of you, Saren said, his face still hidden under his coat. I let him leave with a promise we would see each other soon. Without any doubt, Saren was going to be the one to end my life. I had long accepted I wouldn't grow old, but it had been a while since I was scared of death. Yeah, I was scared. Finally scared of dying. But now, I was also a bit excited to see what I would experience along the way. Depending on what that was, I may need to keep certain things private for Saren's sake. I would recommend looking for the dating website for yourself, as long as you're aware of the risks that come with a cute, yet scary monster partner.